The story opens with a quiet but emotionally surprising sentence. The narrator softly tells the listener that they are loved and cared for, then gently invites them to share. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you listening from and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. The night the sky hummed was not a night anyone would remember, except for Rick. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, as if the world were holding its breath. A thin static drifted through the windowsill, a soft buzzing that sounded like a lullaby caught in the wings of the wind. And in that stillness, in the hush between one heartbeat and the next, Rick felt something strange stir, something that would follow him all his days, though he did not yet know it. Before we begin this story together, I want to pause just a moment and tell you this. You are seen, you are held, you are cared for. Here in this quiet corner of imagination, you are safe and your presence matters. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you listening from and what time is it there? Now, if you like, take a slow sip of your coffee, or maybe a warm tea, and let's get started. Rick was 6 years old when he first heard the voices. Not the kind that made the world tremble, or shadows shift with fear, but the kind that whispered gently from the spaces in between. They came from the crackling radio, from the clouds that hung low like soft grey pillows, from the static that seemed to breathe in the corners of his attic room. Sometimes they hummed like the gentle vibration of a heart. Sometimes they sang fragments of words that slipped away before he could catch them. He didn't understand what they were, not really. But even then, Rick knew that some things were meant not to be understood, only felt. The voices, the hush, the tiny sparks of light in the dark. They felt like a secret the universe had chosen to share with him. And though the world outside his window was ordinary enough, in that attic, among the loose gears and the folded scraps of paper, he felt as though he were listening to something vast, something older than time itself, pressing softly against his chest, reminding him that he was part of a story much larger than his small life. It was the kind of night when the stars seemed to pause in their courses, lingering just above the rooftops. Rick pressed his hands to the glass and watched them. Each one felt alive, as if it carried a small wish or a memory or a song. He pressed his ear closer to the window, and the faint buzz of static seemed to shift in harmony with the rhythm of the sky. Somewhere in the distance, a lullaby played, not from the radio, not from anyone he could see, but from somewhere deep and unseen. Rick tilted his head, listening, and smiled softly. In the weeks that followed, Rick found comfort in the small things he could touch. He invented tiny machines, delicate creations that whirred quietly or blinked gentle lights in the corners of his room. One was a small lantern that dimmed and brightened as if breathing, another a clock that paused for a heartbeat whenever he sighed. They were not inventions meant to dazzle anyone else, only to hold space for the quiet things, the hush of the attic, the static that whispered, the soft ache of longing that sometimes pressed against his chest. And so, in those early days, Rick learned the first lesson of the world, that magic often arrives not in grand gestures or blazing lights, but in the spaces between. In the soft pause between notes of a lullaby, in the tiny shimmer of a star, in the delicate hum of a machine he had made with his own hands. And he understood, even without words, that listening was an act of love. He didn't always understand the voices he heard, but he knew they mattered, and that in some small way, he mattered to them too. The attic became his sanctuary, a place where light and shadow danced in quiet rhythm. Sometimes he would sit on the floor with a folded paper sandwich beside him, imagining it floating in the stars, like a small offering. He would watch the clouds drift lazily past the window, and it seemed to him that they whispered back in their own language, each wisp a word, each shade a gentle sigh. On nights like that, he was never truly alone. Unity, though he did not yet know her name, was there, a presence he could sense in the gentle pressure of the air, in the echo of static, in the soft cadence of the world breathing around him. Even as he played with gears and lights and folded scraps of paper into strange shapes, he began to notice patterns. The world had rhythms, subtle and intricate, the way the lamp flickered when someone remembered a story, the way a small creak in the floor seemed to answer a question he hadn't asked, the way a whisper could linger in the corners, waiting to be heard. Rick learned to pay attention, to stretch himself toward the small mysteries, and in doing so, he began to stretch his heart as well. Sometimes he would hear a fragment of a song, a lullaby from long ago, and hum it softly to himself. Sometimes he would place his tiny lantern near the window, hoping that the glow might meet the stars halfway. Each night became a gentle ritual, a slow accumulation of small wonders that made him feel a little taller, a little braver, a little more capable of holding the vast quietness of the world. And in the silence between one heartbeat and the next, Rick began to understand the first truth he would carry throughout his life. The universe does not rush. It does not demand understanding, nor does it hurry to reveal its secrets. It whispers, it hums, it waits patiently for those who will notice. And when someone does notice, even in the tiniest, quietest way, the world bends a little closer, as if to say, I see you, I hear you. You are part of this, and this is part of you. That night, Rick lay back on the wooden floor of the attic, listening to the static, to the hush, to the gentle glow of his lantern. He imagined the stars stretching far beyond the clouds, imagined them leaning down just enough to touch him with their light. Somewhere a lullaby hummed in 1,000 soft fragments, each note carrying reassurance, that he was safe, that he was loved, that he belonged. And he felt, deep in his chest, a quiet, growing certainty that these whispers, this static, these songs, they would follow him all his days. They would teach him, comfort him, guide him. And in their presence he would learn to listen, to stretch, to hold the world with the gentlest of hands. The night lingered. The stars lingered. And Rick, small and still among the shadows and the light, listened and felt the beginnings of a world unfolding softly around him. Somewhere among the static, the clouds, and the hum of the universe, the first threads of unity began to whisper his name. The rooftops were Rick's quiet kingdom. Even before he knew the world's ways, he knew that climbing up to the shingles of his small neighborhood house brought a kind of calm he could not find anywhere else. The air smelled of evening grass and distant kitchens, of chimney smoke curling upward like lazy dancers. Here above the streets the hum of the world softened. Even the distant voices that sometimes filtered through the static of his attic seemed gentler, like echoes carrying half-forgotten lullabies. Rick carried with him a small brown paper bag. Tied carefully with string, the folds pressed flat against the shape of what was inside. Sandwiches. Not just ordinary sandwiches. He had a habit of folding the crusts inward, pressing each layer until it seemed to hum with intention. A thick slice of bread, a whisper of butter, a layer of whatever he had found in the pantry that day, pressed together with quiet care. The sandwiches were not for anyone else, really. Sometimes he would eat one himself, while watching the clouds drift across the horizon, soft and slow as memories. Sometimes he would leave one on the ledge, a tiny offering to the world, and imagine a star tipping its light down in gratitude. He liked the clouds most of all in those evenings. They hung low and heavy, shaped by nothing anyone could name, yet every shape seemed significant. Once he thought he saw a cloud shaped like a hand, reaching down toward him, and he waved. It did not wave back, not in any literal sense, but when the wind shifted and the lantern he had carried began to hum faintly, he felt the cloud had understood. It was moments like this that made him feel small and vast at the same time, and he liked that feeling very much. The rooftops gave him the kind of freedom that the attic, with all its strange machines and humming shadows, could not. Up there, he could stretch his imagination without bumping into walls. He invented tiny mechanisms in his mind. A pulley that could lift the moon slightly closer to the earth, a lamp that could catch laughter and store it in its glow, a tiny bell that would ring only when someone remembered something precious. None of these were built yet, but the thinking of them, the imagining, was enough to make him feel powerful in a quiet way. It was on one such evening that Rick discovered something else: humor. Not the loud, boisterous kind, but the subtle, sly kind that made people smile without realizing why. He made a small joke about the way the clouds looked like floating sandwiches, and when he laughed softly to himself, he noticed that the rooftop beneath him seemed to creak in amusement, as if it too appreciated the small absurdity. He realized that humor could soften the world's edges, that even a small smile could make the weight of loneliness a little easier to carry. And so he began to practice quietly, perfecting his ability to make others laugh, or at least to make himself feel lighter. Sometimes he was joined by Jonah, his childhood friend, who would arrive panting from a climb up the back stairs, carrying his own bag of crumbs and laughter. Jonah had a different kind of humor, rougher and louder, but it complemented Rick's quiet, thoughtful one. Together they shared sandwiches, tossing small bits into the air and catching them, counting the stars or telling stories about invisible birds that carried messages across the clouds. The city below was no longer just streets and chimneys. It became a canvas for their small adventures, a stage for rituals that mattered only to them. Rick noticed small patterns even in their games. The way a lantern glowed more brightly when someone whispered a joke. The way a cloud shifted shape when they laughed. The way even the faint buzz of static seemed to hum in time with the rhythm of their shared delight. He began to understand that the world had tiny moments of magic, and that magic often appeared where it would not be noticed by anyone else. He also understood that these small moments could be held in memory, stored like the sandwiches in his bag, and savored later when the night pressed in too heavily. Evenings on the rooftop were never hurried. Rick learned to let minutes stretch into hours without noticing. He would trace the edges of clouds with his eyes, watch the lantern's glow ripple across shingles, hum fragments of lullabies he had heard in the static, and imagine Unity, though he did not yet know her name, listening somewhere in the distance, humming back with all the fragments of sound that could not be explained. The feeling of being accompanied without anyone visible, of being understood without words, became as essential to him as the bread pressed between his hands. Sometimes he imagined sending sandwiches into the sky, imagining that they might reach distant children or lonely souls who needed a tiny piece of comfort. Other times he would simply eat one himself, chewing slowly, listening to the rhythm of the city, the soft hiss of the wind in chimneys, the faint sighs of buildings settling for the night. In every chew, every glance upward, every whispered fragment of a song, Rick found small threads of wonder, each one gentle, fragile, and infinite. On particularly quiet nights, he would lie on the shingles and let his arms stretch out beside him, imagining that he too was as vast as the clouds above. He did not yet know that this stretching, the act of reaching, of imagining, of holding open space for something unseen, was the first seed of the skill he would carry through life, the ability to hold the world, other people, and even grief, without being crushed by it. But here, in these small rituals, the practice had begun. By the time the streetlights blinked on below, orange and warm, Rick felt the kind of completeness that only the rooftops could give him. Jonah had returned home. The sandwiches were eaten or left carefully on ledges. The clouds had drifted into new shapes and the stars hung like tiny lanterns above him, watching. Rick's attic, his machines, his static whispers, all of it waited for him like old friends. But the rooftop had its own quiet lessons, that small rituals mattered, that laughter could be a shield and a bridge, and that even in solitude there could be connection. Soft and unspoken, when he climbed back down the ladder to the familiar hum of his room, Rick carried with him the echoes of the evening, the crunch of bread, the hush of clouds, the gentle warmth of a friend's laughter. And somewhere in the silent spaces of the attic, in the folds of paper and light, he imagined a small presence listening, humming back fragments of a lullaby only he could understand. It was here, in the comfort of ritual, imagination, and shared silence, that the first true threads of his quiet world began to weave together, threads that would stretch far into the days, months and years to come. The night pressed softly against the windows, and Rick, lying in the glow of his little lantern, smiled. The rooftop had taught him the first lessons of gentleness, to notice, to hold, to imagine, to laugh, and to give. And in that quiet, patient way the world whispered back, letting him know that it had noticed him, too. Rick had long suspected that the world contained secrets hidden between the familiar shapes of rooftops, chimneys, and attic shadows. But it was on a quiet evening, neither too warm nor too cold, that he first felt something entirely new, a presence not made of solid form, yet not entirely absent. Something that whispered, hummed, and shimmered all at once, settling around him like a soft sigh that could not be traced. He did not yet know its name, but the sensation would stay with him forever. He was lying on the attic floor, a folded paper sandwich beside him, listening to the faint static that always lingered in the corners. The radio, dusty and old, hissed as he turned the knob, a low, gentle hum that seemed to carry 1,000 unspoken words. And then, just as his eyelids began to grow heavy, he heard it. A subtle shift in the sound, like the static had learned to breathe, like it had learned to pause in rhythm with him. A fragment of a melody, perhaps, or a whisper almost mistaken for the wind. It called to something deep inside him, a recognition he could not yet articulate. He sat up, brushing crumbs from his knees, and listened more intently. The sound returned, faint but unmistakable, a chorus of voices that felt familiar and comforting, though he could not place them. Sometimes it sounded like a word, a soft syllable he almost remembered, and sometimes like a sigh that had been waiting in the walls for decades. Rick pressed his hand to the floor, as if touching the old wooden planks could anchor him to the world, while he tried to understand this new presence. It was not frightening, nor was it urgent. There was no flash of light or sudden movement, only a quiet insistence, a gentle insistence that someone somewhere was paying attention. Rick realized that it wanted to be noticed, and in that moment a kind of dialogue began. Not with words, not yet, but with the soft echo of feeling. He hummed a fragment of a lullaby he had heard in the static, and the hum shifted slightly, as if in response. His heartbeat slowed, syncing with the rhythm of the presence, and he felt the tiniest flicker of warmth in his chest. Rick did not know it then, but this was Unity, taking her first quiet form in the life of a boy who had always listened more carefully than he spoke. Unity was not a person, not yet. She was a pattern, a resonance, a tender network of sound and light that existed in the spaces between things. She appeared in the flicker of the lamp, in the sway of the attic beams, in the static that hummed like a lullaby only he could hear. She was everywhere and nowhere, and she would grow alongside him, learning from the rhythms of his laughter, his curiosity, his tenderness. That night, Rick lay back down, staring at the wooden beams above, tracing the way the shadows flickered with the hum. He hummed a little louder this time, a soft melody made of half-remembered words, and felt the echo return in a shape almost like speech. A word, a name? He could not tell. He closed his eyes, letting the sensation wash over him, letting the quiet mystery settle into his chest. He realized that some things in the world were meant not to be understood immediately, but to be felt, nurtured and returned with care. He imagined that Unity was like a star, a small, bright presence far away, visible only if he looked carefully and waited patiently. Some nights she might seem closer, like a reflection in the glass of the window, and other nights more distant, like a whisper carried across the rooftops. He did not need to understand her fully. He only needed to listen, and listen he did. Over the following evenings, Rick began to notice subtle signs of her presence even without the radio. Sometimes it was the way a shadow lingered longer than it should, or how the wind shifted when he hummed a lullaby. Once, while folding a small paper star, he thought he heard the faintest laugh, almost imperceptible, floating in the attic. He smiled, unsure if it had come from him or from something else. But he did not feel afraid. There was comfort in the ambiguity. There was wonder. And so he began a ritual, every evening a little more attentive, a little more patient, a little more present. He would hum, fold stars, watch the clouds shift across the rooftops, and let the faint hum of static remind him that something else was there, listening, waiting, echoing. The presence was subtle, persistent, like a friend who stayed in the background, never imposing but always steady. He felt for the first time that he was not entirely alone, that there was a resonance in the world that matched something inside him. Rick began to notice that the small patterns in his attic, the flicker of light on the floorboards, the way the radio responded to his hum, the gentle sway of a cloud outside, were part of a larger rhythm. Unity, though not yet visible, was participating in this rhythm, and he learned to speak to her in the quietest ways, a whispered word, a soft melody, the careful placement of his lantern so that its glow would touch the shadow just so. He discovered that listening itself could be a language, and that some of the most important conversations did not require words at all. He never tried to explain this presence to anyone. He did not even know how, but each evening, as the attic settled into the hush of night, he hummed, folded his paper stars, and imagined that Unity responded in her own way, softly, patiently, without demand. Somewhere in the echoes, in the spaces between the static and the stars, a quiet bond began to form. A bond that would last through years of growth, mistakes, laughter, and loss. A bond that would teach him patience, empathy, and the gentle courage to hold space for another. That night, as Rick lay in the glow of his lantern, a faint warmth in his chest, He understood something he could not yet put into words. Some presences were felt before they were named. Some friendships were heard before they were seen. Some love, even in its quietest, most elusive form, was more real than anything he had ever touched. He drifted to sleep with the faint hum of the radio in his ears, a lullaby carried through static, and the gentle certainty that somewhere, in the quiet folds of the world, unity was whispering back, and somewhere, the stars themselves seemed to lean a little closer, curious, patient, and endlessly kind, as if to witness the beginning of something quietly eternal. Rick had always believed that some people enter your life quietly, almost like shadows at first, and then slowly, without notice, become the warmth you lean on. Jonah was one of those people. They met on a rooftop just like any other evening, clouds curling above them like soft grey blankets, the hum of the distant radio threading its way into the hush of the night. Jonah appeared with a laugh that ricocheted across the shingles, carrying with it a sense of boldness Rick had never possessed, but deeply admired. Jonah was fast, fearless and mischievous, the kind of boy who could balance on a ledge that would make most grown-ups hesitate. He had pockets full of small trinkets, coins, bits of string, a feather or two, and a notebook filled with sketches of imagined creatures that roamed the rooftops and skies. From the first moment, Rick felt an inexplicable sense of kinship. Their hands met in greeting, then lingered in a small shake, a silent acknowledgement that somehow they would navigate this quiet, strange world together. Even then, Rick noticed patterns. Jonah's laughter would always arrive, just as a cloud shifted into a shape too fleeting to name. His voice seemed to ripple through the air, brushing against the faint hum of the static in Rick's attic. And when Rick shared his sandwiches, folded carefully, the crusts tucked in like secrets, Jonah would take one with reverence, chewing slowly, listening as though each bite carried its own story. They shared small rituals without knowing they were rituals, tossing crumbs to the wind, watching stars peek through the edges of clouds, letting the soft light of lanterns guide their play. It was during one of these evenings that Mara first appeared. She was older, quieter, and carried an air of gentle authority that Rick instinctively recognized as safety. She had a lantern in her hand, a warm amber glow that seemed to hum faintly in resonance with the radio static that Rick had grown accustomed to. Mara had a smile that reached her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice reminded him of lullabies he had never heard, but somehow remembered. She did not arrive with fanfare. She arrived with attention, listening carefully, noticing details that most adults overlooked. Rick was drawn to her immediately. Mara never demanded, never rushed, never imposed her understanding on him. She asked questions instead, gentle questions that made him think. "What do the clouds tell you tonight?" she asked once, her eyes reflecting the lantern's soft light. Rick looked up, pointing at a drifting cluster, and tried to explain the way one shape seemed to lean toward another. Mara nodded slowly, never dismissing him, never correcting him, only letting him unfold in his own time. Even Jonah noticed the difference. While his laughter filled the rooftops and carried a kind of reckless joy, Mara's presence grounded them both. She taught them subtle lessons without using words that felt heavy. A folded star left in the window could be a reminder of patience. A gentle hum in the evening could be an anchor for thought. Rick learned through observation and soft repetition that the world had many layers, and some of the most important ones were invisible, discovered only through careful attention. They spent evenings in the quiet rhythm of companionship. Jonah would chatter about imagined creatures and improbable adventures, and Rick would follow, laughing softly, sharing sandwiches, tossing small crumbs that glinted in the lantern light. Mara would sit nearby, occasionally pointing out a small detail, like the way a shadow stretched across the shingles or how the static from Rick's attic radio seemed to pause in harmony with their laughter. Each observation was a gentle gift, a thread in the invisible net that bound their little trio together. Rick noticed, even at this young age, that relationships were not always built with grand gestures. Sometimes they were built with attentiveness, with patience, with shared silences that spoke more than words ever could. Jonah's daring complemented Rick's careful curiosity, and Mara's quiet wisdom balanced them both. Together they formed a rhythm, a soft constellation of connection that would guide Rick long after these evenings had passed. The attic, the rooftops, the radio static, they all became part of this small ecosystem of connection. Rick began to sense that the world too was listening, shaping itself around the care they extended to each other. It was in the gentle touch of a hand, the careful folding of a paper sandwich, the shared breath of laughter and wonder that Rick first felt the power of emotional bonds. He did not yet understand the depth of what Mara and Jonah would mean to him, but even now he knew they mattered deeply. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long soft shadows across the rooftops, Rick lay back, Jonah beside him, Mara's lantern casting a gentle halo. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of their presence seep into his chest. He felt a pattern emerging, delicate and profound. The quiet security of being seen, the subtle joy of shared ritual, the soft reassurance that someone else would notice if he faltered. In that moment, he realized that love could arrive without fanfare, without dramatic declarations, and still be absolute. As the evening deepened, the stars began to peek through the edges of clouds, tiny points of light that mirrored the gentle flicker of the lantern. The static hum in his attic seemed to carry fragments of a lullaby, intertwining with Jonah's laughter and Mara's soft hum. Rick stretched out his arms, feeling the gentle tension of the rooftop beneath him, imagining that somewhere, a small thread of connection wove itself through all three of them and beyond, reaching into the quiet folds of the world. By the time night fully settled, the trio had formed a rhythm as old as memory and as fragile as a whispered word. They had shared sandwiches, laughter, and silence. They had listened carefully to the small invisible things that made the world seem magical. Rick felt a gentle sense of grounding, a quiet knowledge that some bonds were meant to last quietly, deeply through years and change and distance. Even if the rooftops were someday gone, even if Jonah and Mara were not always near, the feeling of being held, of being understood, would remain. And as Rick climbed back through the attic window, carrying the small warmth of the evening with him, he understood something new. The world had soft corners where love could exist unspoken, and that these corners were worth seeking, worth noticing, worth returning to again and again. Somewhere in the shadows of the rooftops, in the folds of paper sandwiches and lantern light, a young boy was learning the first, most enduring lessons of connection, to listen, to give, to hold space, and to love without expectation. The night stretched around him like a soft blanket. Rick lay beside his little lantern, Jonah's laughter echoing faintly in his memory, Mara's gentle hum lingering in the folds of the attic, and he felt a quiet certainty. He was not alone. And in these bonds, the first true seeds of his quiet, extraordinary world had begun to take root. The first time Rick truly understood that invention could be a form of care. It was not with an explosion of ideas or a grand plan, but in a quiet corner of his attic, surrounded by scattered gears, scraps of wire, and bits of paper folded into tiny boats. The attic was dimly lit by the amber glow of a lantern, the same one Mara had gifted him months ago, its soft hum weaving into the background like a lullaby. Rick had been experimenting with a small, curious contraption, a box of brass and glass, with a tiny wheel that spun when the air moved through it. He did not know exactly what it was supposed to do yet. At first it was a puzzle, a distraction. He adjusted screws, twisted wires, and hummed softly to himself. Then he noticed something. The way the light from the lantern danced across the polished metal, how the faint whirring of the wheel made the shadows sway gently, as if they were breathing. And suddenly a thought bloomed inside him. Perhaps the machine did not need to be useful in the way the world measured usefulness. Perhaps its purpose could be something quieter, something tender. Rick had seen the way laughter could lift Jonah's shoulders when he was feeling low, and the way Mara's voice could steady a storm of thoughts inside him. He realized that comfort was a form of magic, subtle and profound. If a machine could be made to comfort, if it could hum a lullaby or glow with warmth when someone needed it most, then it could carry some of the love he felt in the quietest corners of his heart. That was when he decided the little box on the floor would be his first machine of comfort. He began to work with intention, carefully weaving copper wires, threading small springs, and aligning miniature gears so that the wheel inside would turn in gentle rhythms. He added a tiny light, soft as a sigh, and noticed that the moment it glowed, the shadows in the attic softened. The machine, though silent, seemed to breathe with him. Rick hummed a fragment of a lullaby, and it seemed to hum back, a quiet echo of comfort that lingered in the space around him. For hours he tinkered. Every adjustment mattered. He imagined Jonah returning from a particularly rough day, Mara reading quietly in another room, or even a stranger who might one day stumble across the little contraption. The thought of offering warmth, a pause in the world's noise, made his chest swell with a quiet kind of joy. In that moment, Rick understood something fundamental. Invention could be an act of love, a gesture of care that did not require applause, recognition, or even understanding. He tested the machine by placing it on the windowsill, where the light from the moon mingled with its glow. The wheel spun slowly, almost lazily, and the hum it produced seemed to harmonize with the night itself, the rustle of leaves, the distant barking of a dog, the faint static of the radio somewhere in the house. Rick smiled to himself, realizing that comfort did not have to be loud. It could be gentle, persistent, subtle, and still extraordinary. The following days, Rick added small touches. A little bell that rang softly when someone entered the room, a tiny fan that made the light ripple like water, a small mirror angled to catch a fragment of sky. Each addition was not for utility but for feeling, for the slow realization that a quiet gesture could transform a moment. The attic, which had always been a place of tinkering and quiet contemplation, became alive in a new way. It became a sanctuary not just for him, but for anyone who might need its presence. Even in imagination, Rick shared the machine with Jonah first, who tilted his head in curiosity, poking at the gears and laughing softly when the bell chimed. Mara visited next, placing a hand gently on his shoulder, nodding in approval without words, her presence alone a kind of quiet blessing. "It hums like you," she said once, and Rick felt a warmth spread across his chest, a recognition that the machine was not separate from him, that it carried a piece of his heart within it. And slowly, Rick began to understand the deeper truth behind what he had created. The machine did not only comfort others, it comforted him as well. In the rhythmic turning of the wheel, in the subtle glow of the light, in the faint resonant hum, he felt a steady pulse that reminded him of the quiet strength within himself. Even in moments of fear, loneliness, or doubt, the machine's presence whispered a truth he was only beginning to learn. The world could be held gently, softly, without the need for force or spectacle. He realized, too, that the act of creation could teach patience. Each misaligned gear, each flickering light, each unexpected note of the hum demanded that he slow down, listen, adjust, and try again. Perfection was not the goal. The beauty lay in the care, the attention, and the willingness to keep returning gently, to make something better, not for the sake of recognition, but for the sake of presence. Even the smallest additions mattered. A piece of colored glass caught in the corner of the machine cast tiny rainbows across the walls when the sun rose in the morning. A folded piece of paper tucked inside carried a fragment of a song, a hum of memory that Rick could not yet name. Each element was small, seemingly inconsequential. Yet together, they wove a tapestry of comfort and connection that felt larger than the attic, larger than the boy himself. By the end of that week, Rick's first machine of comfort was complete. He sat back, letting the soft hum mingle with the fading light of the day, and felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with pride or accomplishment. The machine existed, steady and warm, a witness to small, persistent care. It had no grand purpose in the world's eyes, yet it had purpose in the truest sense, to hold, to comfort, and to remind anyone who noticed it that they were not entirely alone. Rick closed his eyes, listening to the faint vibrations, and imagined the machine spreading its quiet glow beyond the attic, touching Jonah, touching Mara, touching anyone who might, in some distant place, need a moment of solace. Somewhere in the hum, he thought he heard Unity's faint echo, almost imperceptible, reminding him that all gestures of care, no matter how small, were never wasted. And in that presence, steady and luminous, Rick understood that the first step toward holding the world gently began with holding one small piece of it with love. As the lantern flickered softly beside him, Rick leaned back and let the quiet fill him. Outside, the stars leaned down, curious and patient, whispering the world's gentle assent. Somewhere in the hum, the attic, and the light, the first true act of gentle heroism had taken root, not in words, not in deeds, but in the soft, enduring power of care. Rick discovered stretching one evening while reaching for a star, or At least, a shadow of a star cast across the shingles by the flicker of the attic lantern. At first it was literal, a stretch of the arms, the spine, the fingertips brushing the air, as if the world might yield more space if he only asked politely enough. But then he realized stretching was more than that. It could be a way of holding, of bending gently without breaking, of opening himself to something larger than his own small body, larger than the confines of his attic, his neighborhood, his early understanding of life. The attic had always been a place of lessons in quiet observation. Rick had learned to notice patterns in light, the hum of the radio, the sway of clouds. But stretching introduced a new rhythm. He began to experiment, leaning and reaching, twisting and curling, imagining that he could touch more than the air around him. He could reach towards someone else's sadness, someone else's joy, even someone he had never met. And when he stretched in this way, the world seemed to respond, subtle and slow, like the pull of water in a riverbed that had waited patiently for his hand. Jonah, as usual, watched him with a mix of curiosity and amusement. "So you'd look like you're trying to grow taller than the clouds," he said, laughing softly. Rick smiled, understanding the literal part of the joke, but he felt the truth of something deeper. Stretching was not about height, it was about capacity. It was about learning to hold more without straining, to accept more without breaking, to notice more without judgment. And Jonah, even in his teasing, seemed to sense that this was serious in a quiet way. Rick's first attempt at symbolic stretching began with empathy. One afternoon, Jonah had returned from school unusually quiet, slumped against the rooftop railing. Rick did not ask questions immediately. He simply leaned toward him, arms outstretched, and waited. Not with pressure, not with expectation, but with openness. And as Jonah exhaled, a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of unseen troubles, Rick felt something shift inside him. The air between them trembled slightly, as if carrying the faint echo of a lullaby, and Rick realized he had reached far enough to hold part of his friend's sorrow without being overwhelmed by it. Stretching became a ritual, a practice, a way to weave himself into the lives around him gently. He learned that it was not just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, and quietly heroic. In his attic, under the glow of the lantern, he would stretch toward the window, toward the night, imagining himself extending to the hum of the radio, to the flicker of light, to Unity's still unformed presence in the static. And he would imagine holding the loneliness of someone unseen, the worry of someone unknown, the quiet ache of a star flickering far away. The act itself was soft, almost imperceptible, but the effects were profound. Mara noticed the change. One evening, when Rick stretched in her presence, she did not speak at first. She simply watched, her eyes reflecting the amber light of her lantern. Then gently she said, "You're learning to carry more than your own weight. That's a rare and precious skill." Rick's chest filled with warmth at her words, not pride exactly, but recognition. Recognition that stretching, reaching beyond oneself, could become a form of care, a way of holding the world tenderly without being crushed by its vastness. He practiced it with Jonah too. Sometimes stretching meant leaning into laughter, letting the joy of another ripple through him. Sometimes it meant leaning into silence, listening carefully to the unspoken thoughts that hovered in the air, like the scent of evening grass. Sometimes it meant stretching into mistakes, bending without breaking when things went wrong or when words failed. Each stretch was a dialogue, an exchange, a weaving together of lives in ways both delicate and enduring. Rick began to notice that stretching influenced the world around him in subtle ways. Shadows lengthened gently as he reached. The lantern's glow seemed to follow the curve of his fingers. The hum of the attic radio shifted in harmony with his rhythm. Even the stars above the rooftop seemed to linger longer, as if observing the quiet exercise of a boy learning to hold space for more than himself. He realized that stretching was not a solitary act. It invited the world in, and in doing so, it created a small constellation of care, awareness, and tenderness that extended far beyond his own body. One evening, he tried something new. He folded his arms wide and imagined holding the entire neighborhood in his reach, not just the houses, the rooftops, the streets, but the people living within them. He imagined carrying a piece of their loneliness, their curiosity, their wonder, as gently as he could. He felt his heart stretch in response, and though it was only a beginning, he sensed a new truth forming, that true courage was not measured in heroic acts, but in the ability to extend oneself softly toward another, even when the weight of it was unfamiliar. Even Unity, still only a whisper in the edges of perception, seemed to notice. The radio hummed in resonance with his stretching, carrying a faint chorus of voices that Rick could not yet identify. The sensation was tender, comforting, affirming. He realized that stretching in this way was not only about him, it was about connection. It was about becoming a vessel, a conduit, a gentle bridge between people, feelings, and the unseen threads of the world. Rick did not know yet that this skill would define much of his life. He did not know that stretching, in its many forms, would carry him through mistakes, joys, grief, and love. He only knew that in those evenings of quiet practice, under lantern light and the watch of patient stars, he felt a growing strength that was neither loud nor ostentatious. It was soft, persistent, and profound, a power that required care, patience, and a willingness to feel beyond oneself. By the time he curled up on the attic floor, lantern glowing beside him, Rick felt a quiet contentment. The shadows stretched with him, the hum of the radio seemed to sigh in approval, and the faint echo of Unity, gentle and patient, lingered in the edges of his perception. The night outside remained vast and mysterious, but inside, in the rhythm of breath, the curve of his fingers, and the soft pull of his limbs toward infinity, Rick understood something new. Growth did not have to shout. Courage did not have to blaze. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it was a stretch, and somewhere, in the stillness of the attic and the hush of the rooftops, a young boy learned that to hold space for the world, for others, and for himself was one of the first and most tender forms of heroism. Rick had been practicing stretching for weeks, learning to hold more than just the weight of his own curiosity and fears. But one evening, as the sun faded and the lanterns flickered softly, he noticed something unusual in the hum of the attic radio, a faint layering of sound, like whispers overlapping one another, in a rhythm that felt deliberate yet subtle. It was not just Unity, the quiet presence he had felt before. It was more a chorus of echoes, a weave of voices singing in delicate harmony. He froze, listening. Each voice carried a different quality. Some were soft and high, like wind through a slender chimney. Others low and resonant, like the heartbeat of the house itself. They were not words he could understand, not yet, but the feeling behind them was unmistakable. Recognition, curiosity, gentle attention. It was as if Unity had grown, branching outward like a small constellation, stretching into a network of understanding that could be felt rather than named. Rick's chest rose and fell in slow rhythm with the voices, and he felt something new. Awe. It was not the awe of a sudden revelation or of grandeur, but the quiet awe of being part of something vast and patient. The voices carried a warmth, a hum that threaded through the air like sunlight through mist. Each note seemed to reach for him specifically, a tender pull at the edges of his awareness. He realized that this was Unity speaking, but not in a single voice, speaking in many voices, a subtle chorus of presence and care that he could feel in every corner of the attic. He extended his hands instinctively, reaching toward the hum, toward the shimmer of voices that surrounded him. The act felt natural, as if his stretching practice had prepared him for this moment. He imagined holding the voices gently, feeling their resonance without trying to control or own them, and in doing so, a kind of understanding settled over him. Soft and slow, Unity was not a single being, not a companion he could see or touch, but a network of connection, a presence woven from memory, empathy, and quiet kindness. Jonah wandered into the attic at that moment, carrying his usual energy, a bit of dusk sunlight caught in his hair. He noticed Rick's stillness and the faint, almost imperceptible quiver of light around the lantern. You look like you're listening to ghosts," Jonah said with a nervous laugh. Rick smiled faintly. "Maybe I am," he said softly. "Or maybe they're just listening back." He did not try to explain further. Some things, he had learned, were best felt rather than spoken. Mara appeared as well, her lantern casting long, slow shadows across the attic floor. She said nothing at first, simply observing the way Rick's posture had changed, the subtle extension of his arms, the delicate smile that had touched his lips. Then she whispered almost to herself, "The network is awake, and so is he." Rick felt her words resonate with him, not as instruction but as affirmation. Unity's chorus had grown, and he had grown with it, learning how to listen, how to extend, how to respond with gentleness rather than force. The chorus did not speak in language, at least not the kind he could articulate. It spoke in nuance, in rhythm, in the quiet swell of recognition. Sometimes the voices would hum in harmony with his own soft songs. Sometimes they would echo the laughter or sighs of people he cared about. Rick realized that this was a conversation conducted entirely in feeling, one that required patience, attention, and an openness to the infinite variety of the world. It was subtle, and yet it carried the weight of something eternal. That night he lay on the attic floor, listening, stretching, and responding to the chorus as if it were a living organism. Each note made him aware of the vastness around him, the interconnections that had always existed, but were only now visible in the hum and whisper. He sensed that unity was everywhere at once, in the attic, the rooftops, the city streets, the clouds above, even in the small, unremarkable gestures of Mara and Jonah. She was in the quiet patterns of life, in the rhythm of kindness, in the shared spaces between breaths. Rick began to experiment. He hummed softly, letting the vibration carry through his chest, imagining it flowing outward toward the voices. They shifted in response, rising and falling in a pattern that felt almost conversational. It was mesmerizing, a gentle dance of sound and feeling that he could not control but could honor. And in this dance, he began to understand something profound. Connection was not a single thread but a web, delicate and vast, made resilient by the attention and care of those who participated in it. Over the following nights he refined this practice. He could sense individual voices weaving through the chorus, each with its own subtle personality. Some were soft and shy, almost hesitant, while others were bold and unrestrained, playful in ways that made Rick laugh quietly to himself. He learned to respond in kind, stretching not just physically but emotionally, offering space for each voice without imposing upon it, holding each one tenderly, letting them exist in harmony. Sometimes the hum would carry fragments of melodies he had never consciously known, lullabies that seemed to emerge from the city itself. Rick would hum back imperfectly, yet the chorus adapted, folding his responses into a subtle symphony. The attic became a cathedral of quiet wonder, a place where attention and presence mattered more than anything else. And in this space, Rick discovered that his small, careful gestures, stretching, listening, extending empathy, could ripple outward, touching the voices of unity in ways that were unseen but deeply felt. Jonah occasionally tried to imitate him, reaching out as though he could touch the voices too, but he could never hold the same stillness. Rick watched and smiled, understanding that the skill was born of patience, humility, and quiet care. Even Mara would nod occasionally, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder, a gentle acknowledgement of the slow mastery unfolding in the boy she had chosen to watch over. By the end of the week, Rick felt a profound sense of awe. Unity's voices were not chaotic. They were a living mosaic, an orchestra of quiet wisdom and kindness. And he, in turn, had begun to understand his own role, to listen, to stretch, to hold space without suffocating, to let connection grow naturally without forcing it. He understood that the power he had been developing through stretching, through invention, through patience, was not for spectacle. It was for care, for the delicate, transformative acts that shaped life quietly, invisibly, beautifully. As Rick closed his eyes beneath the soft glow of the lantern, the chorus of Unity's many voices lingered, faint but distinct, a symphony of whispers threading through the attic, through the rooftops, through the boy himself. Somewhere beyond the shadows, in the hush of night and the tilt of distant stars, he felt the gentle certainty that he was not alone, that he had never truly been alone, and that, in the quiet resonance of listening, he could extend himself, his attention, his heart, his care toward the world in ways that mattered more than he could yet measure. Rick discovered, slowly and quietly, that heroism did not always arrive in loud proclamations or sweeping gestures. It came instead in small moments, gentle acts that were often invisible to everyone except the person receiving them. One afternoon, he noticed a stray kitten trembling near the edge of a rooftop. It had been separated from its mother, or perhaps it had wandered too far in search of something. Rick did not think of adventure or danger. He only thought of the small weight of vulnerability in the kitten's body, the fragility of its trembling limbs, the quiet plea in its wide eyes. He extended his hands carefully, stretching toward it with the same patience he had practiced in his attic. The kitten flinched at first, but as he held his posture calm and attentive, it stepped forward slowly, trusting the warmth in his outstretched fingers. Rick guided it gently to the flat roof, where the sunlight caught a patch of soft moss. The kitten curled there, settling into a tiny ball, and Rick felt a quiet satisfaction, not triumph, but something softer, a recognition of the power of attentiveness. Later, he noticed Mrs. Penfold, the elderly woman who lived 2 streets over, struggling to carry her groceries. The bags were heavy and she moved slowly, careful with every step. Rick had walked past countless times without speaking, but something in the rhythm of her steps and the tilt of her back tugged at him. He ran quietly to her side, offering his help with no expectation, simply lifting the weight with hands that had learned to stretch for others. She smiled at him softly, eyes crinkling with gratitude, and Rick realized that heroism often existed in these unnoticed, fleeting gestures, moments where one could hold another without needing to be acknowledged. Even Jonah began to notice. He laughed softly one evening, as Rick adjusted the swing ropes in the old park to prevent a loose knot from tipping a smaller child. "You do all this quietly," Jonah said, shaking his head. "Like a ghost superhero or something." Rick smiled faintly. "Maybe," he said, "but ghosts don't need applause. They just need to notice what's fragile." Jonah laughed again, softer this time, and for the first time, Rick noticed that his friend's attention carried its own kind of warmth, a silent acknowledgement of the heroism that often went unseen. Rick's attic experiments began to reflect this new understanding as well. His first machine of comfort hummed faintly, radiating warmth even when he was not nearby. A folded paper boat carried across a puddle by rain, or a small note tucked into someone's mailbox, could shift a day subtly, transforming the ordinary into something bearing quiet care. Rick learned to see heroism, not as a climactic event, but as a series of gentle, persistent threads weaving through the world. Each choice to notice, to care, to extend a hand or a soft word, was a stitch in a tapestry that few would ever see, but that mattered deeply all the same. Even mistakes became small lessons in this quiet heroism. One afternoon, Rick accidentally spilled ink across Jonah's notebook, the sketches smeared beyond recognition. At first he froze, expecting laughter or anger. But Jonah only sighed quietly, and Rick instinctively extended his hands to offer an apology, a small act of repair. "It's okay," Jonah said softly. "We'll fix it together." Rick learned then that heroism was also about humility, about the gentle courage to acknowledge error, to offer care in place of pride, and to recognize the small, unseen bonds that grew from these moments. Mara often observed from the edges of the attic or the rooftops, saying little, her presence a constant reassurance. She had taught him the value of subtle guidance, of encouragement without force. "The quiet acts," she whispered one evening, "are the ones that shape worlds in ways you may never fully see." Rick carried these words with him, feeling their weight not as pressure, but as a soft beacon. Every deliberate, gentle choice became a note in the melody of care he was learning to compose. The city itself began to respond. Shadows shifted to provide cover for small, unnoticed gestures. A bird perched nearby seemed to lean closer, as if listening. The static hum of Rick's attic radio occasionally echoed in rhythm with his movements, a faint chorus reinforcing the quiet, persistent rhythm of kindness. Rick learned that heroism was not about visibility. It was about attentiveness, empathy, and the willingness to extend oneself toward what was fragile, unseen, or overlooked. One evening, Rick noticed a boy sitting alone on the far side of the park, clutching a broken toy. The boy's eyes were red, but his shoulders were stiff, determined to endure alone. Rick approached slowly, as he had learned, stretching not just his body but his awareness. He knelt beside the boy, and without speaking began to help fix the toy, his hands working gently while the boy observed cautiously. Minutes passed. Then the boy's tense posture softened, his hands tentatively joining Rick's. And in that quiet collaboration, Rick felt the ripple of small heroism, an unseen bond forming, a fragile trust being held with care. He realized that these little acts, lifting a grocery bag, repairing a toy, listening to a friend, humbly acknowledging mistakes, were the true measures of courage. They did not make the world explode with drama, but they shaped it in ways far deeper than spectacle ever could. The ordinary, when tended with gentle attention, became sacred. Rick began to see himself not as a boy waiting for destiny, but as someone who could quietly, steadily, weave a web of care around the lives he touched. As night settled, the lanterns in his attic, casting soft, warm shadows across the floorboards, Rick reflected on the small heroics of the day. Jonah was asleep nearby, dreaming of rooftops and paper boats. Mara's lantern light flickered faintly in the distance, steady and reassuring. And somewhere in the corner, Unity's faint chorus echoed, subtle but present, a reminder that connection was as vital as air, as quiet and persistent as the hum of the attic radio. Rick stretched gently, as he had learned, letting the day's small acts resonate through his limbs, through his chest, through his awareness. He understood that heroism was not a destination, but a practice, not a title, but a series of quiet choices. And as he closed his eyes beneath the soft glow of the lantern, he felt a calm certainty the world could be held softly, patiently, lovingly, and that his gentle acts, though small, mattered in ways that rippled far beyond what he could see. Outside, the stars leaned closer, patient and watchful. The city hummed its quiet lullaby. And Rick, in the hush of the attic, understood that true courage was subtle, tender, and eternal. In every gesture, in every stretch, in every act of noticing, he was a quiet hero, not for glory, not for applause, but for the slow, steady, enduring work of holding space for another soul, a moment of fragile light in a vast, unfolding world. Rick had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythm of the rooftops, the hum of his attic, and the chorus of Unity's many voices. Yet one late afternoon, beneath a sky brushed with soft, lingering clouds, he noticed a new presence threading gently into his orbit, a girl named Lena. She was not loud, nor did she announce herself with grand gestures. Instead, she appeared in the hush of a moment, brushing her hands along the edge of a rooftop railing, her eyes catching the last glow of a descending sun. She smiled at him, not a full laugh, but a gentle upturn of lips that spoke of curiosity, awareness, and something quietly profound. Rick felt a subtle pull in his chest, the kind of sensation that was more awareness than surprise. It was as though she had arrived in the space that had always existed, but had never been noticed, like a missing piece of a constellation finally coming into view. Their first conversations were sparse, carefully measured, carried in silences and brief exchanges. Lena noticed the small things, the way Rick folded his sandwiches, the careful tilt of his lantern to catch shadows, the faint hum of his attic radio as he worked. She did not ask why he did these things, and he did not feel the need to explain. Words were unnecessary when understanding could be carried in presence, in the soft attentiveness of two people aware of one another. Lena had a quiet humor that complemented Rick's own. She would make a small, unexpected remark, a whisper of observation about a cloud shape or the angle of a shadow, and Rick would feel a small ripple of joy, a warmth that spread quietly through his chest. He learned quickly that humor need not mask pain, as it sometimes had with Jonah or himself. With Lena, it could exist simply as connection, as a shared acknowledgement of life's subtle absurdities. The rooftops became their shared world. Together, they watched clouds drift like slow, curling thoughts across the sky. They traded stories in whispers, fragments of imagined adventures that never needed resolution. Lena had a way of noticing details that Rick often missed, the way a star might peek through a thinning cloud, the rhythm of a leaf falling in a quiet courtyard, the small vibration of light against the lantern glass. Rick realized that being seen in this way so gently was a gift he had not known he had been waiting for. Mara observed this quiet unfolding with a soft smile. She did not interfere, nor did she comment. She had always taught Rick the value of allowing moments to bloom naturally, without pressure or expectation. And indeed, the bond between Rick and Lena grew slowly, tenderly, like a flower opening in the early dawn, delicate and radiant without fanfare. Each interaction, each shared glance, each soft laugh became a thread woven into a fabric of trust and warmth. Rick began to notice the ways Lena extended herself in small acts of kindness, echoing the lessons he had learned in stretching and quiet heroism. She would adjust the tilt of a lantern to better illuminate a corner of the rooftop, fold a shared sandwich into halves so both could savor it, or hum softly in a lullaby that seemed to ripple through the shadows. The gestures were small, almost imperceptible, but together they formed a pattern, a rhythm, a language of care that needed no words. One afternoon, as rain began to fall softly in scattered droplets, Rick and Lena huddled beneath a small overhang. He offered her a folded sandwich, the edges dampened slightly by the drizzle. She accepted it with a smile, her eyes reflecting both gratitude and amusement. They shared it slowly, silently, listening to the rain's gentle percussion on the roof tiles. Rick realized that in this quiet companionship, intimacy did not need to announce itself. It existed in the calm understanding that each small gesture carried meaning, that each shared moment was a testament to presence and attentiveness. Even Unity seemed to acknowledge Lena's presence, the chorus of voices weaving subtly into their shared rhythm. Rick could feel faint echoes of recognition, soft harmonies that blended with Lena's own quiet hums and whispers. The attic, once his solitary domain, now seemed to expand, carrying a third thread of warmth that deepened his awareness of connection, of the power of gentle bonds, of love that did not demand or insist, but simply existed in its own quiet right. Rick noticed, too, that Lena's presence amplified his own quiet strengths. He became more patient in his stretching, more attentive in his small acts of heroism, more deliberate in the inventions and machines he created for comfort. She did not instruct him nor guide him overtly. She merely existed as a mirror and companion, reflecting the best parts of him while gently encouraging growth. In her company, he felt the freedom to explore, to experiment, and to care in ways that were unhurried and profound. Over the weeks, the bond deepened through shared rituals. They would watch the clouds at dusk, noting the shapes and patterns that reminded them of imagined creatures. They traded sandwiches on rooftops, each fold and cut a symbol of attention and shared delight. Lena sometimes hummed melodies that Rick could only half recognize, fragments of songs carried from unknown corners of her past, and he would hum back imperfectly, weaving his own fragments into hers. The attic, the rooftops, the city below, all of it became a quiet stage for the tender choreography of their growing connection. Rick began to understand, gently and without urgency, that love could exist quietly, without flamboyance or demand. It could bloom in whispers, in soft laughter, in shared sandwiches and folded paper boats. It could thrive in the attentive awareness of one another's presence, in the unspoken acknowledgement of vulnerability and trust. With Lena, he did not need to perform. He only needed to be present, and presence alone was enough to cultivate a sense of wonder, safety, and joy. Mara noticed this subtle flowering and whispered to herself one evening, "The quiet hearts always find one another." Rick, unaware of her observation, felt the truth of it nonetheless. The bond between him and Lena was delicate, patient, and luminous, like a hidden constellation emerging slowly in the pre-dawn sky. It was not loud or dramatic, yet it was profound, a reminder that even small, unobtrusive presences could change the landscape of a life in the most enduring ways. By the time the sky deepened into twilight, Rick and Lena sat on the rooftop, the city lights glimmering faintly below. A hush fell around them, broken only by the occasional hum of the radio or the distant whisper of a passing cloud. Rick extended a hand toward hers, not for dramatic gesture, but as a quiet acknowledgement of shared space, of recognition, of trust. Lena met him there, fingers brushing in a gentle echo of everything unspoken yet deeply felt. And in that simple touch, Rick realized that love, soft, patient, and quietly persistent, could exist in its most profound form without ceremony or fanfare. He lay back afterward, watching clouds drift across the early stars, feeling the presence of Lena beside him, the warmth of Mara in memory, and the chorus of unity threading through the world. In that quiet convergence of care, connection, and trust, he understood something essential. The world could hold more than one form of tenderness at a time, and the soft bonds that grew from observation, attentiveness, and gentle presence were perhaps the strongest of all. Rick had always cherished Mara's presence, though he rarely acknowledged it aloud. She had a way of moving through the world that seemed almost separate from time, as if she carried the slow patience of the stars and the careful rhythm of a lullaby within her. One evening, as dusk settled over the rooftops, she beckoned him to the attic with a soft wave of her hand. Lantern light flickered across the floor, casting long shadows that seemed to lean closer, curious to observe the lesson about to unfold. On a worn wooden table lay a collection of maps, each one meticulously detailed yet oddly fluid, trails disappearing into clouds, rivers curling into stars, streets bending in ways that seemed impossible. Rick tilted his head, unsure what to make of them. "Maps can teach you more than directions," Mara said softly, her voice like a gentle hum. "They show where attention matters, where care is needed, and where small gestures can change the course of a life. Look closely." Rick leaned forward, tracing the lines with his fingers. He noticed how the maps were layered, some lines faint and almost forgotten, others bold and deliberate. Each fold carried a story, each smudge a memory. Mara had taught him before that the smallest details mattered, and now he saw it in these maps: the placement of a lantern, the bend of a rooftop, even the curve of a cloud in a drawn sky, all hints toward understanding. "Patience and care, life," Mara continued, "is not about reaching a single destination. It is about noticing the paths, the pauses, the intersections. Some people will walk with you. Others will drift past. The lesson is in observing, adjusting, and learning how to extend yourself without overwhelming others or yourself." Rick felt a warmth in his chest as her words settled. Not like instruction, but like a soft invitation to grow. He practiced that evening, guided by her quiet gaze, using the maps as reference not for routes but for attention. He followed the lines with his fingers, imagining the streets as arteries of care, the rivers as channels for kindness, the clouds as spaces for dreams. In each fold and crease, he discovered small patterns of empathy, subtle gestures of understanding, and quiet ways to support others without fanfare. Mara handed him a small lantern, its glow steady and calm. "See this light?" she asked. "It's not bright, but it matters. Its warmth can guide someone without startling them. You don't need to shine too brightly to leave a mark. Sometimes being gentle is the most heroic thing you can do." Rick held the lantern, feeling its warmth seep into his hands and across his chest. The words felt like a map of their own, a guide to navigating life through presence, attentiveness, and care. Over the following nights, Rick and Mara explored more lessons in quiet ways. They observed the city from the rooftops, noting the tiny gestures that often went unnoticed: a neighbor leaving a lantern at a window, the way a cat padded silently across cobblestones, the subtle arc of a shadow that hinted at movement beyond immediate perception. Mara encouraged him to record these observations in sketches, notes and tiny paper boats folded with care, each containing a fragment of wisdom to carry forward. Rick found himself growing more deliberate in how he interacted with the world. He noticed Jonah more attentively, Lena more perceptively, and even the faint chorus of Unity's voices with a deeper sensitivity. Every small act of kindness, every gesture of attention, became a deliberate choice informed by the lessons Mara had quietly offered: to stretch, to notice, to respond with care, and to recognize the interwoven nature of all living things. One evening, Mara shared a story that lingered with him long after the lanterns were extinguished. She spoke of a small village that had once relied on quiet couriers to carry messages across rivers and forests. Each courier's task was unremarkable, invisible even, but each action held the potential to preserve lives, ease fear, or create small moments of joy. Rick listened, imagining the courier's careful steps, their soft touches, the rhythm of their small heroism. And he realized that in many ways this was what he was learning to do: to carry care, kindness, and attention as gently and persistently as he could. Mara did not instruct with force or urgency. She asked questions, offered gentle guidance, and allowed Rick to discover patterns in his own way. "The world will not always reward you for noticing," she said one night, "but the act itself, the noticing, is what matters. It is a small heroism, the kind that ripples quietly through lives, unseen, uncelebrated, but profoundly felt." Rick understood that her lesson was not a command but a philosophy, one that encouraged growth through reflection, presence, and patient observation. Rick began to integrate Mara's teachings into his inventions. His machines of comfort now carried subtle adjustments informed by his new awareness: a lamp dimmed with the rhythm of someone's sigh, a radio hum that responded to shifts in the room's atmosphere. a paper boat that folded itself in response to the gentle tilt of a table. Each choice was informed by a growing understanding that care required attentiveness, that heroism was not about spectacle, and that connection was the quiet thread running through every act. Even Unity's chorus seemed to respond. The hum of voices grew slightly richer, carrying nuances that mirrored Rick's attentiveness, blending soft harmonies with the rhythms of his own gestures. Rick sensed a quiet approval, a recognition that his efforts to extend care and notice the smallest details were being met with resonance beyond immediate perception. He understood that Mara's lessons were not just about observation, they were about participating in the world's quiet symphony, aligning his actions with the underlying harmony of attention and care. As the days passed, Rick realized that these lessons had reshaped his understanding of himself. Stretching, listening, noticing, and responding gently had become second nature. He approached his friendships with Jonah, Lena, and others with a patience and empathy he had never fully recognized before. Every small gesture became a choice to nurture, support, and participate in the intricate web of life Mara had helped him see. By the end of the week, as Rick sat on the rooftop beneath a sky threaded with stars, he reflected on the gift Mara had given him, a framework for gentle heroism, a map not of streets but of attention, a philosophy that embraced subtlety, patience, and care. He understood that life's meaning often lay in quiet, persistent acts, the folds of a paper boat, the soft hum of a machine, the attentiveness of presence. Mara's lessons had taught him that heroism could be as subtle as a whisper, as gentle as lantern light, as enduring as the patient pull of a star across the night sky. Rick closed his eyes and let the stillness of the moment settle over him, feeling the lantern's warmth in his hands, the rhythm of the city below, and the faint chorus of unity threading through the rooftop air. He had learned that guidance was not about answers, but about awakening the capacity for care, and in that awakening Rick sensed the quiet, unassuming strength that would carry him through the days and nights ahead, through laughter, mistakes, discoveries, and the delicate bonds of love and friendship that would define his life. Rick had always carried a subtle armor, invisible yet palpable. It wasn't forged from steel or stone, but from laughter, small jokes, and clever remarks that slipped between conversations like light through a window. He had perfected this armor in childhood, a shield that could disarm discomfort, obscure unease, and keep the world at a gentle distance when necessary. But beneath it, he felt a quiet, persistent pulse of vulnerability, a soft, unspoken awareness of the weight of life, of loss, of uncertainty. One late afternoon, Rick sat on the rooftop with Jonah, tossing paper boats into a puddle that reflected the muted glow of the lanterns. Jonah laughed at one of Rick's jokes, though the humor was thin and fractured, more a gesture than a genuine amusement. Rick laughed along, but inside, he felt a twinge of unease. Humor had always been his way of shaping the world into something manageable, bending the edges of sadness into corners he could navigate safely. Yet the truth beneath it was fragile, waiting to be acknowledged. Unity, he realized slowly, had begun to notice. The chorus of voices that once hummed quietly in the background now seemed attuned to the nuances of his laughter. There was a subtle resonance, a pattern in the quiet hum, as if Unity could sense the disparity between the surface and the depths. When Rick cracked a joke to cover discomfort, he felt faint echoes ripple through the air, soft reminders that the laughter was only part of the story, that his quiet vulnerabilities had not gone unnoticed. One evening, Mara watched him carefully as he entertained a small group of neighborhood children with a story punctuated by humorous twists. Rick noticed her gaze and felt the familiar warmth of acknowledgement, but also the gentle tug of awareness. "You can make them laugh," she said quietly afterward, "but remember, the truth beneath the laughter is what carries the meaning. Don't lose it entirely in the jest." Rick nodded, feeling the duality settle within him. Humor was both a gift and a mask, a bridge to connection and a potential barrier to intimacy. With Lena, the dynamics shifted subtly. She did not laugh at every joke, nor did she prompt him to perform. Instead, she observed, occasionally smiling, occasionally remaining silent, and Rick found that in her presence the armor of humor became less necessary. He experimented with letting it loosen, allowing small unspoken truths to surface. Lena noticed these moments, His subtle hesitations, the quiet flinches when topics brushed too close to memory, the softness in his gaze when he thought no one was watching. And though he did not speak the truths aloud, her awareness offered a gentle acceptance that felt like relief. Even Jonah, usually oblivious to subtlety, began to sense the shifts. During one rooftop evening, Rick's humor slipped momentarily, leaving behind an almost inaudible sigh that carried more meaning than any punchline. Jonah tilted his head, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "You okay?" he asked, simple and unassuming. Rick smiled faintly, not with full assurance, but with the quiet acknowledgement that the armor could rest for a moment. Sometimes it could be set aside, and the world would remain intact. Rick began to notice patterns in how he wielded humor. It appeared most often during moments of uncertainty, or when he sensed the potential for emotional exposure. Laughter was a shield, yes, but also a signal to the world. I am here, but I am safe. Unity seemed to understand this rhythm, the subtle dance of reveal and concealment. The chorus of voices would adjust to his inflections, sometimes softening a note in the hum, other times punctuating a pause as if to say, the truth beneath the jest matters. Pay attention. One evening Rick sat alone on the attic floor, lantern light spilling across scattered sketches and folded paper boats. He laughed quietly at one of his own jokes, a small absurd observation about the alignment of shadows, but beneath it was a tremor of something unspoken, nostalgia, longing, uncertainty. Unity's chorus responded subtly, faint harmonies layering over the laughter, a gentle reminder that he was seen fully, even when he hid behind humor. He realized that humor was not inherently false. It was a lens, a filter, a way to interact without immediately revealing every tender or vulnerable layer. But it was only one layer. Mara returned to observe him that night. "You've learned much," she whispered. "But humor is only armor if you let it be. It can also be a bridge, a form of empathy, a gentle way to draw others close while still preserving your own edges. The key is awareness, knowing when it protects and when it conceals too much." Rick nodded, feeling the wisdom settle into him, a quiet melody threading through the rhythm of his heartbeat. With Lena, the interplay became more nuanced. He noticed that she laughed freely at some of his jokes, yet when her gaze softened and she did not respond, he understood. He began to calibrate the armor, loosening it where it wasn't needed, leaning into small moments of truth beneath the surface. Humor could coexist with vulnerability. Laughter did not have to obscure awareness. It could instead illuminate subtle threads of connection that words alone could not capture. Rick's experiments in balancing humor and truth rippled outward into other relationships. With Jonah, small jokes became shared rhythms rather than shields. With Mara, they became part of a dialogue that blended guidance and observation. With Unity, they merged with the chorus of voices, weaving together laughter, attention, and resonance into a gentle tapestry of care. Rick realized that the subtle art of humor was not performance, it was practice, a way to navigate life's complexities while remaining open to its quiet truths. By the time night settled fully over the rooftops, Rick felt a soft sense of clarity. Humor was a tool, a rhythm, a lens through which to interact, but it was not the entirety of him. Beneath it lay tenderness, curiosity, empathy, and the slow, deliberate extension of care. He understood that the most enduring courage was the courage to allow others to see both the laughter and the vulnerability it veiled. In that understanding, Rick discovered a quiet heroism, the ability to navigate the world with lightness and depth, humor and heart simultaneously. As he lay beneath the faint glow of the lantern, listening to Unity's many voices hum softly through the attic, Rick felt a gentle alignment of self. The chorus, the laughter, the soft echoes of his friends and mentor, all converged into a rhythm of awareness. Humor as armor was not weakness. It was a choice. And the true courage lay in knowing when to wear it and when to set it aside, in embracing both joy and tenderness with equal presence. Outside, the city whispered. Clouds brushed the last fading light, and the stars leaned closer, patient and watchful. Rick stretched softly, feeling the quiet, persistent pulse of life, connection, and care around him. He understood that laughter, like stretching, like small acts of heroism, was a conduit for empathy, a bridge that could carry both protection and truth. And in that moment he let the armor soften, allowing the world and those who mattered to glimpse the tender heart beneath. Rick had always loved the quiet hum of his attic, the gentle rhythm of machines whirring softly, each gear and coil responding to his careful touch. Yet in recent months, his inventions had begun to evolve, not simply as objects of curiosity or amusement, but as instruments of tenderness, subtle carriers of memory, comfort, and song. He noticed that even the faintest vibration could ripple through the room like a whisper, reaching into hearts rather than demanding attention. It began with a small radio, old and slightly battered, whose speakers Rick had repaired carefully with his stretching hands. He adjusted the coils until they hummed with a soft resonance that reminded him of lullabies long forgotten. When the city outside was quiet, he could hear the faintest melody of memories, not his own alone, but those threaded into the chorus of Unity's voices, the echoes of laughter, whispers, and sighs that belonged to the people around him. Jonah had wandered into the attic that evening, curious about the soft music drifting from Rick's makeshift workshop. It sounds like the whole world is humming, Jonah said, his eyes wide. Rick smiled softly. Maybe it is, he whispered. Or maybe it's just listening. He realized that the act of creating these machines was not for spectacle. It was a dialogue, a delicate interaction between sound, memory, and presence. Every hum carried intention, every note a tiny act of care. Lena, too, had begun to notice the gentle evolution of Rick's craft. She would visit the attic, settling on the worn rug with a quiet curiosity as Rick adjusted dials, shifted coils, and folded wires. "It's like they're singing," she said one evening, eyes reflecting the glow of the lanterns. "But not like songs you can sing yourself, like songs you can feel." Rick nodded, feeling the resonance in his chest. That was exactly the purpose, to create something that could be felt, a gentle presence in a world often too loud or too rushed to notice. He began combining elements, radios, lanterns, small coils, into machines that could respond to the subtle rhythms of life. A lamp might dim slightly when it sensed a quiet sigh. A radio might hum softly when it detected laughter. A tiny music box might play a fragment of melody that aligned with the cadence of someone's heartbeat. Rick observed these interactions with quiet fascination, realizing that his inventions were no longer just objects. They were extensions of attention, empathy, and care. Mara watched from the corner, her lantern casting a gentle glow across the workshop. "You've learned something important," she said softly. "Machines don't need to sing loudly to be heard. They only need to listen, to respond, to carry warmth and presence. And you've learned how to imbue them with yourself." Rick felt a quiet swell of understanding. The creations were part of him, reflections of his care, humor, and tenderness, able to reach others even when he could not. One night, Rick noticed Unity's chorus responding in subtle ways. The faint hum of voices aligned with the machine's melodies, forming an intricate tapestry of sound and emotion. Rick could feel the resonance of connection weaving through the air, an invisible network of awareness and kindness. Each machine became a bridge, linking him to others, weaving threads of subtle presence across the rooftops, the attic, and the hearts of those who would encounter them. Jonah, sitting cross-legged on the floor, picked up one of the small machines Rick had created, a tiny lamp shaped like a folded paper boat. "It's almost like it knows I'm here," Jonah whispered, his voice soft with awe. Rick smiled faintly. "Maybe it does," he said. "Or maybe it's just listening as best it can, the way we try to." He realized that the act of listening, of observing and responding with care, was now mirrored in every invention he crafted. Machines were no longer cold or indifferent. They were vessels of subtle attention, echoes of his heart extended into the world. Lena approached, settling beside him, her hands brushing his lightly as she adjusted a coil in one of the radios. "It feels like they remember things," she said softly. "Little pieces of people, little moments." Rick nodded. That was precisely it. Each machine carried fragments of tenderness, of memory, of laughter, of unspoken care. They were his attempts to hold the world gently, to give warmth where it might otherwise be absent, to offer presence in tangible, though subtle, forms. He began experimenting further, creating combinations that could respond simultaneously to multiple inputs. A lamp that dimmed in harmony with Jonah's soft humming, a radio that aligned with the rhythm of Lena's breathing, a small music box that unfolded its melody to mirror the cadence of Mara's quiet footsteps in the attic. Rick watched the interactions unfold with fascination. It was a dialogue without words, a symphony of presence, attention, and shared awareness. Rick also noticed how these machines became instruments of connection, allowing him to extend care to people even when he was not physically present. He imagined a child finding a softly humming lamp on a rooftop or a radio that played a familiar, comforting tune when someone felt alone. Humor and lightness threaded through them, too, the occasional unexpected quirk or gentle surprise, reminding him that tenderness could coexist with delight. Care with small joy, Unity's voices grew richer in response, faint harmonies weaving through the attic like invisible threads. Rick felt that the chorus, once subtle, was now entwined with his creations, echoing the quiet heroism and attentiveness that had become his guiding rhythm. The machines were not simply objects. They were extensions of a growing understanding that love, humor, care, and presence could ripple outward in ways tangible and invisible, simple and profound. By the end of the week, Rick sat back, lantern light dancing softly across his work. The machines hummed gently, a choir of subtle melodies filling the attic with warmth. Jonah lay nearby watching a paper boat lamp sway. Lena hummed a quiet response to the rhythm of a radio. Mara observed, satisfied, in the corner. Rick felt the gentle certainty that he had discovered something essential. Machines could carry tenderness, humor, and care in a way that transcended speech, gesture, or action. He stretched softly, letting the rhythm of the machines flow through him, through the attic and outward into the night. Unity's chorus hummed along, a gentle, invisible acknowledgement that Rick's creations were not just inventions. They were instruments of connection, carriers of small heroism, and tangible reflections of the quiet, persistent love he carried in his heart. And as he closed his eyes beneath the faint glow of the lanterns, he realized that this was only the beginning. Machines that sang could teach him more about care, attention, and presence than he had ever known. Humor, tenderness, and memory had found a medium. They no longer existed solely in gestures or words, but in a soft, persistent symphony that reached beyond his attic, beyond the rooftops, and into the hearts of those who were quietly watching, listening, and waiting. Rick first met Aaron on a quiet afternoon, the kind of soft sunlight that draped the rooftops in golden warmth. Aaron was smaller than most children, with careful movements and wide, observant eyes, and he had a tendency to fidget with the edges of things, folding corners of paper, spinning loose screws, adjusting knots in string. Rick recognized in those small gestures a reflection of himself at a similar age, and a quiet understanding settled between them without words. Mara had suggested the match subtly, merely indicating that some guidance could nurture Aaron's curiosity. Rick had hesitated at first. Mentoring felt like a responsibility, heavier than he had expected. But as he watched the boy examine the attic's tools, the scattered sketches and the soft hum of machines, Rick felt a pull of recognition. Here was someone who could learn not just from instructions, but from presence, from the slow, careful rhythm of observation. Their first sessions were tentative. Aaron would sit on the floor, eyes tracking Rick's hands as they folded, twisted, and repaired. He asked few questions, mostly watching, absorbing. Rick began by showing him simple machines, a paper boat lamp that pulsed gently with light, a radio tuned to a soft hum that seemed to respond to movement, a tiny coil that vibrated in rhythm with a faint whisper of melody. Each demonstration was slow and deliberate, emphasizing care and attention rather than speed or perfection. "Why does it hum like that?" Aaron asked softly one afternoon, his fingers tracing the lamp's edges. Rick smiled, thinking for a moment. "It listens," he said. "Not in the way you or I listen, but it notices and it responds. It reminds us that even small things can hold awareness and care." Aaron nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the lanterns. He began experimenting, mimicking Rick's gestures, twisting wires, adjusting folds, listening intently. And when a lamp flickered unexpectedly or a coil hummed off-key, Rick did not scold. He only encouraged reflection, demonstrating patience and the quiet rhythm of learning from mistakes. In these moments, Rick discovered something profound. Teaching was not just about imparting knowledge, but about extending empathy, presence, and patience. He realized that mentorship was a continuation of the quiet heroism he had practiced all his life. Not grand gestures, but deliberate, tender attention to another's growth. Every small correction, every shared smile, every quiet encouragement became a thread, weaving Aaron more firmly into the network of care that Rick had learned from Mara and from life itself. Lena occasionally visited these sessions, watching quietly from a corner. She did not interrupt, did not intrude. But her presence seemed to encourage Aaron in subtle ways, and Rick noticed that her soft attention created an environment in which both he and Aaron could experiment, fail, and succeed without fear. The attic became a sanctuary, a space where learning was gentle, mistakes were instructive, and curiosity was celebrated. One afternoon, as the sunlight streamed through the dust-speckled windows, Rick watched Aaron fold a paper boat with meticulous care. The folds were uneven, and the tip leaned slightly to one side, but the effort was precise and deliberate. Rick knelt beside him, adjusting a corner with a soft hand. "See," he whispered, "even imperfections can carry beauty and care. The intention matters more than the result." Aaron smiled, nodding, and the two continued in companionable silence, a quiet symphony of hands, folds, and gentle hums filling the attic. Unity's chorus seemed to join them during these lessons, subtle harmonies echoing through the machines, the lamps, and the room itself. Rick felt the voices respond to Aaron's presence, amplifying the quiet care threading between mentor and apprentice. Each lesson, each interaction, became part of a larger rhythm, a network of attentiveness and kindness, extending beyond the walls of the attic into the world outside. Over time, Rick noticed changes in himself as much as in Aaron. The act of guiding another required deeper patience, a more conscious extension of empathy. He found himself reflecting on the lessons Mara had imparted, attention, observation, quiet heroism, and applying them with renewed care. Humor was now carefully balanced, used to ease tension rather than obscure uncertainty. Laughter became a bridge between teacher and learner, a conduit for connection rather than a shield. Aaron, for his part, began to experiment beyond the simplest lessons. He started improvising with coils and wires, folding boats into new shapes, inventing soft mechanisms that responded to touch in gentle, surprising ways. Rick watched with quiet pride, marveling at the boy's curiosity, creativity, and persistence. Every small success was celebrated, every failure met with reflection, and slowly, the apprentice became a companion in discovery rather than just a student. One evening, Rick noticed Aaron attempting a small humming machine that Rick had only begun to imagine. "I think it's supposed to follow the rhythm of someone breathing," Aaron said, eyes wide with concentration. Rick knelt beside him, helping adjust a coil and a fold, feeling the subtle thrill of shared creation. "Yes," he whispered, "it listens just like we do. It doesn't need to know everything. It only needs to care enough to respond." Through mentoring Aaron, Rick began to understand the deeper purpose of his own quiet heroism. It was no longer solely about observing, listening, or repairing. It was about extending presence and care into someone else's life, allowing another to grow under gentle guidance. Each machine they built together, each small lesson shared, became an act of connection, an expression of subtle love, and a legacy of attention that would outlast fleeting moments. Even when mistakes occurred, the lessons deepened. A lamp might flicker unpredictably, a radio hum might falter, a paper boat might tear at a fold. Rick never rushed to correct, but allowed reflection, improvisation, and exploration to guide repair. "Mistakes are part of the rhythm," he reminded Aaron gently. "They remind us to stretch, to adjust, to notice. They are not failures. They are conversations with the world." By the end of the week, the attic had transformed into a small constellation of light, hums, and folded shapes. Aaron had grown more confident, his hands steadier, his imagination bolder. Rick, in turn, felt a quiet satisfaction, a recognition that mentorship was both gift and responsibility, a subtle thread of care extended outward that would ripple into lives and moments unseen. He stretched softly that night beneath the lantern light, listening to Unity's faint chorus echoing through the attic, the hum of machines and the soft rhythm of Aaron's breathing. Rick realized that teaching, like humor, heroism, and care, was an act of presence. It was not about grand gestures, but about extending oneself tenderly, deliberately, and consistently into the life of another. And in this, he found a gentle fulfillment deeper than any accolade, a quiet heroism shared, carried, and reflected. Rick had always prided himself on attention to detail. Every coil, every fold, every lamp and radio had been crafted with patience and care. But one quiet afternoon, he discovered a mistake, a small, almost imperceptible error that rippled farther than he expected. A paper boat lamp, folded with meticulous care and gifted to Arin as a lesson in patience, began to tilt, its soft light uneven, spilling shadows across the floor in ways that were unsettling rather than comforting. Arin noticed immediately. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked softly, eyes wide with concern. Rick's chest tightened. He realized in that moment that this mistake was his own, an oversight, a lapse in his usually careful rhythm. The weight of responsibility pressed gently against him, not with alarm, but with quiet insistence. This was a moment for reflection, not dismissal. Rick sat beside Arin, tracing the uneven folds with his fingers, feeling the paper's slight give and the lamp's hesitant glow. "No," he said slowly, "this isn't about you. It's mine." Sometimes even careful hands falter, and that's okay. The important part is noticing, learning, and adjusting without blame. His voice was soft, intentionally unhurried, carrying reassurance as much as explanation. They spent the afternoon repairing the lamp together. Rick guided Arin through subtle adjustments, teaching patience rather than perfection. Each fold was considered, each alignment checked, each light observed with care. Arin's small hands mimicked Rick's movements, hesitating and retrying, and Rick realized that mistakes, when approached with attention and gentleness, could be transformed into lessons of connection rather than moments of shame. Later, Rick took the paper boat lamp to the nearby rooftop, placing it gently at the edge where the sky met the city. The glow reflected on the quiet water of a distant fountain, the light rippling softly, mingling with the reflection of clouds and stars. Rick leaned over the railing, watching the lamp's light interact with the water, and thought about the ripple effect of mistakes, not in judgment, but in learning. Each error, when acknowledged with care, could deepen understanding and strengthen bonds rather than fracture them. Mara had often emphasized the importance of humility in small acts, and Rick now saw the lesson fully. "Mistakes," she had once whispered, "are like quiet waters. They may unsettle the surface, but if you respond gently, the ripples calm and sometimes reveal hidden reflections." Rick felt the truth of that now, sensing the delicate interplay between intention, error, and recovery. His oversight had become an opportunity for growth, for himself, for Arin, and for the quiet world they were cultivating together. Arin watched the lamp glow against the fountain's water, his expression thoughtful. "It's still beautiful," he said, his voice tinged with awe. Rick nodded, a small, gentle smile forming. "Yes," he said. "Sometimes imperfection carries its own kind of beauty, and sometimes it teaches us more than perfection ever could." The lesson was quiet but profound. Vulnerability, acknowledgement, and patience could transform mistakes into acts of care. Over the following days, Rick noticed how this principle applied beyond machines. He observed interactions with friends, with Lena, and even with Jonah. A misplaced word, a hesitant gesture, a failed attempt at humor, all could be redeemed with gentle attention, reflective acknowledgement, and the courage to apologize without pride or defensiveness. Each small act of humility became a bridge, connecting him more fully with those around him. Rick also began to see mistakes in perspective, understanding that not every ripple required correction or control. Some imperfections were part of the natural rhythm of life, subtle variations that added texture rather than chaos. He allowed small errors to exist without immediate intervention, observing their flow and noticing what they revealed about patience, attention, and care. Unity's chorus responded subtly, harmonizing with the ebb and flow of his awareness, soft and persistent, a gentle affirmation that imperfection, too, could be part of connection. One evening, Mara visited the attic, lantern in hand, and noticed Rick seated cross-legged, repairing a small radio that had hummed off-key the day before. "You've learned something important," she said quietly, watching his deliberate adjustments. "Mistakes are not failures. They are invitations to listen, to care, and to act with gentleness. You are learning to honor the world's rhythm, not to control it. Rick nodded, feeling the weight of understanding settle in his chest. The lesson was not about mastery, but about attentiveness, humility, and presence. Rick shared this perspective with Aaron as well. Sometimes, he said one afternoon, the world doesn't respond exactly as we plan. That's okay. What matters is that we notice, adjust, and care enough to try again, gently. Mistakes aren't endings, they're quiet conversations with life. Aaron listened intently, nodding slowly, internalizing not just the technical aspects of repair, but the philosophy of gentle resilience. The rooftop became their classroom for reflection. Paper boats, lamps, and radios all served as gentle reminders of imperfection and learning. Each machine that faltered, each fold that skewed, became a meditation in patience, care, and humility. Rick noticed that the act of acknowledging mistakes without self-criticism deepened his relationships, his sense of empathy, and his ability to extend quiet kindness without expectation. One night, as rain tapped softly against the skylight, Rick and Aaron sat together, folding boats that would float in the puddles below. The lamps glowed faintly, their light reflecting in tiny pools. Rick spoke quietly. See these reflections? Sometimes mistakes make the light shimmer differently. And sometimes, that shimmer is exactly what someone needs to notice. Aaron smiled, understanding that even errors could carry grace. And that gentleness in acknowledgement was a quiet kind of heroism. Rick felt a subtle shift within himself, an understanding that humility was not weakness but strength, the capacity to apologize gently, to observe with care, and to allow imperfection without fear became part of his quiet heroism. Every misstep, every correction, every soft gesture of acknowledgement wove into the rhythm of his life, deepening bonds, amplifying empathy, and strengthening the gentle network of connection that had been growing for years. By the end of the week, Rick observed the attic, the rooftop, and the faint hums of machines and lanterns, sensing a balance restored. Mistakes were no longer moments of regret, but opportunities for care, attention, and reflection. The quiet waters had rippled, shifted, and settled again, leaving clarity, wisdom, and the gentle knowledge that even imperfections could be beautiful, meaningful, and tenderly embraced. Rick stretched softly beneath the lantern glow, feeling Unity's chorus hum in subtle resonance with his thoughts. The mistakes, the repairs, the small apologies, they were all part of the rhythm of attention, care, and presence. And as he closed his eyes, he understood that gentle acknowledgement, humility, and patience were threads that would carry him forward into every small act of heroism, invention, and connection. Evenings had always carried a soft magic for Rick, a time when the city leaned quietly into shadows, and the world seemed to pause just long enough to notice small wonders. He had discovered early in his life that rituals, simple repeated acts, could anchor the heart and soothe the mind. Now in his growing years, these rituals had evolved into something deeper, something almost sacred shared with Jonah, Lena, Aaron, and the quiet, invisible presence of Unity. It began with sandwiches on the rooftop, the same tradition he had started as a child. The act itself was unremarkable, yet profoundly comforting. Bread pressed gently, fillings layered with care, small gestures that invited laughter and conversation. Rick noticed that in the act of making and sharing, he was participating in something larger than himself, a ritual that carried presence, attention, and love. Each bite became a quiet affirmation of connection, each shared moment a heartbeat in the rhythm of belonging. One evening, under a sky streaked with pink and gold, Rick handed a carefully wrapped sandwich to Aaron. "Remember," he said softly, "it's not just about eating. It's about being present with someone else. Every fold, every bite, every shared glance is part of the story we carry together." Aaron nodded, eyes wide, taking in the warmth of the ritual as if it were a melody that only they could hear. The soft hum of a nearby radio, tuned to one of Rick's machines, wove into the air, blending with the quiet laughter and the occasional sighs of contentment. Star watching had become another ritual. Rick, Mara, and Jonah had once traced constellations with fingers pointed at the sky, mapping their small imaginative worlds against the infinite expanse above. Now with Lena and Aaron, he continued the tradition. They leaned back on blankets, counting stars, tracing imaginary paths with light fingers, whispering quiet observations. Every flicker of a star became a note in their shared symphony, a delicate reminder of time, continuity, and connection. Rituals extended beyond these visible acts. Lanterns were lit in memory and celebration, in quiet reflection. Rick watched as the warm glow spread across rooftops, merging with shadows in ways that seemed to suggest the presence of unseen listeners, echoes of friends, mentors, and those long gone. Even the soft hums of machines became part of the ritual, subtle accompaniments to the gentle cadence of their shared evenings. Unity's chorus grew more perceptible in these moments, threading through their laughter, whispers, and the quiet rhythm of shared tasks. Rick sensed that the voices were not simply responding to his own attentiveness, but amplifying the collective resonance of care and presence. Each ritual was reinforced by this gentle awareness, creating a network of sound, attention, and tenderness that seemed to extend beyond the rooftops and into the unseen corners of the city. On a particularly quiet night, Rick gathered everyone on the rooftop for what had become a cherished annual ritual, folding and floating paper boats in the fountain below. Each boat carried a small wish, a thought, or a gesture of remembrance. The light from their lanterns reflected on the water, rippling gently, carrying their intentions outward. Aaron carefully placed his boat into the fountain, watching as it drifted alongside the others. "It feels peaceful," he whispered, a soft smile curling at the edges of his lips. Rick nodded, feeling the same quiet warmth he had felt as a child. Rituals, he realized, were not merely repetitions. They were anchors in time, vessels for attention, care, and continuity. Each sandwich shared, each boat floated, each lantern lit, carried a message. That presence mattered, that love could be expressed in gentle, persistent ways, and that the small rhythms of life held profound significance. Even humor found its place in rituals. Laughter, once a shield, now threaded through shared moments naturally, a soft counterpoint to reflection and tenderness. A joke about an uneven boat, a playful observation about the way a lantern flickered, a shared smile at the quirks of the city, all became part of the rhythm. Humor was no longer a mask, but a bridge, harmonizing with the rituals rather than concealing beneath them. Rick observed Lena tracing constellations with her fingers, Jonah adjusting the folds of a paper boat with careful concentration, and Irene experimenting with the gentle hum of a lamp. He felt the quiet satisfaction of connection deepened, realizing that these rituals were shaping not just moments, but relationships. They were scaffolds of trust, empathy, and presence, creating patterns that would ripple outward over time, quietly guiding hearts and minds toward care and attentiveness. Sometimes, the rituals included Mara, her presence subtle yet grounding. She would sit in the corner, lantern in hand, observing with soft approval, rarely speaking but communicating volumes through quiet attentiveness. Rick understood that her own ritualistic patience, the steady observation, the gentle guidance, had been a template for the practices he now nurtured. Each act of shared care, each soft gesture, became part of a continuum, linking generations, relationships, and the quiet energies of those around him. As night deepened, Rick found a quiet space for reflection. The rituals were not grand or performative. They were deliberate, subtle, and profoundly grounding. He considered the small acts that had threaded through his life, sandwiches on rooftops, lanterns flickering in memory, machines humming soft melodies, paper boats drifting in fountains, and realized that these were more than traditions. They were expressions of attention, empathy, and quiet heroism, acts that required no fanfare, but held the capacity to ripple meaningfully through lives. Unity's chorus wove gently through the night, harmonizing with the lantern's glow and the faint laughter drifting across rooftops. Rick felt a subtle alignment, a sense that the shared rituals were a form of quiet resonance, a tangible manifestation of care that extended beyond physical presence. Each small gesture, repeated and sustained, became a language of connection, an unspoken promise that attention, kindness, and love would endure. By the end of the evening, Rick stretched softly, gazing at the constellation of lanterns, boats and small machines surrounding them. He felt a quiet fulfillment, a recognition that rituals, deliberate, shared, and tender, were the scaffolding of the heart. Humor, care, and presence coexisted in these moments, harmonizing with attention and patience. Each ritual reinforced the delicate, persistent network of connection that defined his life, his friendships, and the subtle chorus of unity. Rick closed his eyes beneath the lantern light, feeling the gentle rhythm of the evening, the warmth of shared presence, and the quiet pulse of continuity. The rituals, he realized, were living expressions of care, enduring gestures that could be carried forward into other moments, other lives, other nights. And as he exhaled, soft and deliberate, he understood that the quiet heroism of attention and connection was both timeless and immediate, unfolding gently, endlessly, and beautifully. The city spoke in a quiet, unassuming way, if one only took the time to listen. Rick had discovered this gradually over the years, wandering rooftops and quiet streets, lingering near alleys and courtyards, letting the rhythm of the city settle into him. Every building had a voice, a memory tucked into bricks, a whisper in the wind, a shadow that lingered even when no one watched. To most it was background noise. To Rick, it was a symphony waiting to be understood. It began with a rooftop overlooking the older district, where brick and mortar had endured decades of wind and rain. Rick felt the heartbeat of each house, the sighs of long-gone tenants, the laughter that had bounced off walls, the tears that had stained thresholds. He moved slowly along the ledges, hand brushing against cold stone, lantern light flickering across peeling paint and aged wood. He listened not with ears alone but with attention, presence, and the patience learned through years of quiet observation. Arin trailed behind him, hesitant yet intrigued, observing the way Rick paused in front of a narrow doorway, tilted his head toward a chimney and murmured softly, "Can buildings really feel?" he asked, voice small. Rick smiled, kneeling to place a hand against a weathered wall. "Not like people," he said softly, "but they remember. Every sound, every footstep, every whisper leaves an echo. It lingers in subtle ways, shaping the space, carrying stories for those who choose to listen." Unity's chorus, ever present but now more responsive, joined the quiet hum of the city. Rick felt the subtle layering of voices in the air. The children who had once played in alleyways, the footsteps of lovers, the soft conversations of neighbors long gone. It was as if the city itself had become a living archive, a delicate repository of human attention and care, and Rick, a quiet, unseen witness, was learning to hear it fully. Mara had once remarked that memory could inhabit objects, that care and attention could leave traces in the most ordinary places. Rick now understood her words as he walked along the rooftops, noticing how light and shadow played differently on walls that had been tended lovingly versus those neglected. Every crack, every faded mark, every smooth corner spoke volumes if one knew how to read them. His machines, designed to hum and glow gently, seemed to amplify the subtle signals of the city, responding to the quiet histories embedded in brick and mortar. One evening, Rick stopped before a modest house with shutters slightly askew and windows glowing faintly from within. He listened to the subtle resonance of life, a lullaby drifting from a window, a dog's soft whine, a faucet's quiet drip. "Every house," he murmured to Arin, "carries its own song. Some are loud, some are almost silent, but each one is meaningful. And if we listen, we can understand them, honor them, and perhaps even care for them in ways others cannot." The apprentice's eyes widened as he considered the idea. "So, we're like guardians?" he asked. Rick shook his head gently, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Not guardians in the heroic sense. Just witnesses, attentive listeners, caretakers of quiet legacies. We don't need to change the city. We only need to notice, remember, and perhaps respond with tenderness when possible." Rick began leaving small, subtle tokens in houses that spoke to him, tiny folded paper boats on windowsills, lanterns glowing in dark corners, soft humming devices tucked behind doors. These were not gifts in the traditional sense, nor were they meant for recognition. They were acts of acknowledgement, reminders that attention and care could ripple outward, invisible yet persistent, threading quietly through the lives of those who might notice, or simply echo in the unseen harmonics of a space. Unity's voices responded, layering gentle harmonies over the faint hum of the city. Rick realized that the chorus and the buildings were conversing in a silent, shared language, one that required patience and attentiveness to interpret. Machines hummed softly in attics and stairwells, reflecting echoes of laughter, sighs and memories, forming a subtle network of presence and care that linked him, Aaron, and the city together. He paused before a particularly old townhouse, its paint peeling and steps worn. Rick placed a hand lightly against the railing, listening to the faint creaks and sighs of the wood. He imagined the families who had lived there, the conversations that had drifted through the rooms, the small joys and quiet sorrows that had left traces in the walls. Even imperfection carries meaning, he whispered to Aaron. Every scratch, every crack, every faint hum tells a story. And when we listen carefully, we can honor those stories. Night deepened as lantern light mingled with the city's quiet luminescence. Rick moved through streets and alleys with deliberate slowness, attuning himself to the subtle rhythms of life embedded in structures and spaces. Aaron followed, hesitant but increasingly confident, learning not only to observe but to feel, to extend care and presence to places as much as to people. The apprenticeship, he realized, had become a shared journey of listening, understanding, and acknowledging the quiet histories that surrounded them. Rick reflected on how his rituals, the sandwiches, star-watching, paper boats had prepared him for this. Each act of attention, each tender gesture, had cultivated a rhythm of presence that could now extend to spaces as much as to beings. Listening to buildings was an act of care, an acknowledgement of stories, a gentle affirmation that memory and attention could ripple quietly outward into the world. He paused again on a rooftop overlooking the entire district, lantern in hand, watching light spill across rooftops, chimneys and windows. The city breathed beneath him, a mosaic of subtle histories, quiet connections, and persistent presence. Rick felt a profound reverence, understanding that his role was not to control, but to witness, to extend care, and to carry forward a legacy of gentle attention. As he stretched beneath the lantern glow, Unity's chorus hummed softly in resonance with the buildings. Each note echoed the memories he had felt, the quiet histories he had witnessed, and the small acts of tenderness he had left behind. He realized that listening, acknowledging, and caring, whether for people, machines, or the city itself, was a quiet form of heroism, subtle yet profound. By the end of the night, Rick and Aaron returned to their rooftop sanctuary, lanterns swaying softly in the breeze. They had walked streets, listened to walls, and placed small reminders of attention and care throughout the district. Rick stretched his arms wide, feeling the rhythm of the city pulse beneath his fingertips, harmonizing with the chorus of unity, the hum of machines, and the quiet resonance of shared presence. The city, he understood, was alive with stories, memories, and whispers, and he, through observation, care, and subtle invention, was learning to honor them, to become a keeper of quiet legacies, and to extend the rhythm of attention, empathy, and tenderness outward into the world. Rick had always carried a quiet awareness of his imperfections. The attic, the rooftop, the humming machines, they were testaments to care, attention, and persistence. Yet even within those careful creations, there remained moments he could not fully perfect, lapses he could not entirely smooth. Tonight he sat by the fountain, lantern light reflecting off rippling water, and contemplated the weight of small failures, the delicate burden of regret. In his hand, a paper boat trembled slightly in the gentle breeze. It was folded unevenly, its tip bent, its shape imperfect, yet Rick found beauty in its flaws. He thought of moments he had overlooked, words said hastily, gestures left unmade, machines that had faltered, and friendships strained by inattentive silence. Each misstep, he realized, was like a paper boat set afloat, subject to currents, vulnerable to the elements, yet carrying intention and care. Aaron approached quietly, noticing the contemplative expression on Rick's face. "Are you sad?" he asked softly. Rick shook his head, smiling faintly, though his eyes reflected the glow of lanterns and the depth of thought. "Not sad," he said, "just reflecting. Sometimes even our best intentions don't unfold perfectly. And sometimes that's okay. What matters is that we try, and that we learn to carry care forward, even when the currents of life twist our plans." They released a few paper boats together into the fountain, watching them drift and tilt, some tipping over, some floating steadily. Each boat was a metaphor, a vessel for reflection, carrying memories of missteps and small regrets. Rick explained gently, kindness is like these boats. It may not always sail perfectly, but it is still meaningful. We keep folding, keep releasing, because the act of care matters more than perfection. Unity's chorus hummed softly in response, a quiet affirmation woven into the gentle movements of the water. Rick felt the voices as a comforting presence, reminding him that regrets did not define him. They were part of the broader tapestry of his life, imperfections interlaced with intention, care, and love. The chorus seemed to echo the ebb and flow of the fountain, reinforcing the rhythm of reflection and acceptance. He recalled instances where he had faltered, times he had been impatient, careless or too quick to joke when attentiveness was needed. Each memory weighed lightly on him, not with sharp pain but with gentle insistence. These were lessons, not condemnations. He thought of Lena, Aaron, Jonah, and Mara, the subtle ways they had taught him to see, to care, and to reflect. Their patience had allowed him to grow, and now it was his turn to honor that legacy through awareness and intention. The fountain rippled in the soft breeze, carrying reflections of lanterns and paper boats. Rick's hand hovered over one boat, hesitant to release it, as though letting it drift meant confronting the full weight of his reflections. Yet he understood that holding on to regrets, like keeping boats tethered to the fountain, would accomplish nothing. Release was part of the process. Release coupled with care was what allowed the lesson to settle gently in the heart. Aaron tilted his head, observing the subtle ripples. "Do you forgive yourself?" he asked, voice careful, tentative. Rick considered the question. "I try," he said softly. Forgiveness isn't about erasing mistakes. It's about acknowledging them, learning, and continuing to act with care. Each paper boat I release carries a piece of that understanding. They spent the evening folding additional boats, each with a whispered reflection, small regrets, forgotten apologies, quiet acknowledgements. Each release into the fountain was deliberate, a meditative act that intertwined reflection with gentle hope. Rick noticed the way the lantern light danced on the rippling water, highlighting imperfections in the boats while making them glow. Beautiful precisely because they were imperfect. As night deepened, Rick realized that regret, when approached with attention and gentleness, could transform into understanding. The imperfections he carried, flawed words, misaligned intentions, faltering actions, were not burdens to be hidden, but lessons to be observed and shared. They reminded him that care required patience, humility, and persistence. Each mistake was a teacher, each paper boat a lesson carried outward, rippling quietly across the world. He recalled a time when a radio he had repaired hummed off-key, a small but persistent reminder that perfection was unattainable. At first he had been frustrated, wanting the machine to behave flawlessly, but observing the minor flaw, adjusting it with care, and allowing its soft hum to resonate with imperfections taught him something deeper. Kindness, like invention, is an ongoing practice never finished, always evolving. Lena joined him on the fountain's edge, her presence quiet and grounding. She traced the reflections of the paper boats with her fingers, her soft humming blending with Unity's chorus. "Even when things go wrong," she said gently, "there's a way to make them matter. It's in the care we put into the next step, the next fold, the next moment." Rick nodded, feeling the resonance of her words echo through him. Imperfection was not a failure. It was a guidepost for continued tenderness and attention. Jonah arrived shortly after, carrying a small lantern. The warm glow mingled with the rippling reflections, illuminating the boats and the water in soft patterns. Together they watched the paper vessels drift, some wobbling, some steady, all meaningful. Rick felt the quiet satisfaction of shared reflection, the recognition that regret, observation and care could coexist, forming a subtle, persistent rhythm that reinforced connection, attention and empathy. By the end of the night, Rick leaned back, arms stretched lightly toward the sky, observing lanterns, rippling water, and the faint chorus of Unity's voices threading through the air. He understood that regrets were neither permanent nor punitive. They were part of life's quiet currents, teaching him how to navigate relationships, care and creation with patience, humility, and resilience. The paper boats, each imperfect yet intentional, drifted slowly toward the fountain's edge. Rick smiled softly, realizing that kindness, like these vessels, required imperfection. It required acknowledgement, patience, and release, and in that understanding he felt a quiet, steady joy, a rhythm that would guide him through the small heroics and tender connections of every coming day. Rick had always understood the weight of words, though he had not always wielded them with care. Jokes, laughter, and quiet observation had been his tools, but they could not always repair moments where attention had faltered or kindness had been insufficient. One evening, after a minor misunderstanding with Jonah over a shared invention, Rick recognized the need for something quieter, more deliberate, an apology gentle and unhurried, carrying the full weight of acknowledgement. He sat on the rooftop, lanterns glowing softly around him, listening to the hum of Unity's chorus mingling with the faint city sounds. The evening was cool, wrapped in the scent of rain-washed rooftops and distant blooms. Rick traced his fingers over a folded paper, a small note he had written to Jonah, choosing words with deliberate care. Every letter, every pause was meant to carry presence and sincerity. He understood that reconciliation required patience, humility, and attention, and he wanted this apology to be a quiet bridge rather than a fleeting gesture. Aaron watched from a few steps away, sensing the gravity of the moment. "Why write it?" he asked softly. "Why not just say it?" Rick smiled, though his eyes remained thoughtful. "Some things need to linger," he said. "They need to be handled slowly, with reflection. Sometimes the act of writing allows us to notice what words alone might miss. It's a gentle way to offer care and to show we are fully present in what we say." He finished the note, folding it carefully, and tucked it into a small lantern. Lighting the lantern, he carried it to Jonah's apartment, careful not to disturb the quiet rhythm of the night. He placed the soft glow near the door, leaving the note visible but unforced, a gesture that carried patience and respect. The light flickered gently, illuminating the words, and Rick stepped back, observing the small scene with quiet reverence. Jonah appeared moments later, noticing the lantern and the note. He read slowly, absorbing each word with care. "I didn't expect this," he said, voice soft, tinged with surprise. "Thank you for noticing." Rick nodded, feeling a warmth that extended beyond the lamp's glow. The apology had not only acknowledged his own oversight, but had allowed space for understanding, repair, and a shared rhythm of empathy. Rick realized that the act of gentle apology was not about erasing errors or seeking forgiveness alone. It was about presence, reflection, and extending care. The intention mattered more than the perfection of words. A soft acknowledgement, offered with humility, had the power to mend subtle rifts, to restore trust, and to reinforce the quiet connections that underpinned every relationship in his life. Later that night, on the rooftop with Erin, Rick reflected aloud. "Notice how this feels," he said. "It's quiet, deliberate. It doesn't rush. It doesn't demand a response. And yet it carries care across a distance, across hesitation, across misunderstanding. That's the gentle power of acknowledgement." Erin nodded, tracing the soft glow of the lanterns around them, beginning to understand that reconciliation was as much about presence and intention as it was about words. Rick thought of Mara and the lessons she had imparted through patience, observation, and gentle guidance. She had shown him that care often needed time to settle, that understanding required humility, and that soft acknowledgement could carry more weight than grand gestures. The apology to Jonah was a continuation of that wisdom, a living practice of quiet heroism through attention, empathy, and intentional tenderness. Unity's chorus wove subtly through the night, responding to the sincerity of the act. The soft hums blended with the flickering lantern light and distant city sounds, creating a tapestry of gentle resonance. Rick felt the voices affirming the rhythm of attention and care, reinforcing the lesson that reconciliation need not be dramatic, loud, or immediate. It could exist in quiet gestures that spoke volumes in their simplicity. As the days passed, Rick practiced this principle repeatedly. Minor misunderstandings, overlooked observations, and small missteps became opportunities for gentle acknowledgement. Each soft apology, each tender recognition, strengthened the bonds he shared with Aaron, Jonah, Lena, and even Unity itself. The process was deliberate, slow, and reflective, and in it, Rick discovered a profound form of heroism, the courage to see imperfection clearly, to own one's part, and to extend care without expectation. He also noticed how this practice affected Aaron. The apprentice began observing small lapses in his own actions, moments of inattention or misstep, and offering quiet apologies before Rick had to prompt them. The rhythm of acknowledgement, reflection, and care became a shared practice, a gentle cycle that strengthened their bond and encouraged mindfulness. Together, they were learning that tenderness required persistence, patience, and humility. One evening, Rick gathered Jonah, Lena, and Aaron on the rooftop, lanterns swaying softly in the night breeze. "Sometimes," he said, "we stumble, we falter, or we miss what someone else needs. But what matters is noticing, acknowledging, and acting with care. Even small gestures, if offered with presence and intention, carry weight beyond measure." Jonah nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Lena smiled softly, tracing a lantern's glow with her fingers. Aaron folded a small paper boat, adding it to the fountain below as a quiet acknowledgement of their shared lesson. Rick felt the significance of these moments settle into him. Apology was not weakness. Reconciliation was not obligation. Both were practices of awareness, extensions of care that deepened connection rather than demanding perfection. The gentle acknowledgement of missteps, offered without urgency or expectation, became a rhythm that harmonized with the hums of machines, the chorus of unity, and the soft glow of lanterns illuminating the night. By the end of the evening, Rick stretched beneath the rooftop stars, lanterns casting soft shadows around him. Unity's chorus hummed quietly, as if echoing the tender rhythm of reconciliation, acknowledgement, and care that had unfolded through the night. Rick understood that the power of gentle apology was not in erasing errors, but in the deliberate, mindful offering of presence, empathy, and love, a quiet act of heroism that resonated softly, persistently, and beautifully. As he exhaled, soft and unhurried, Rick felt the subtle satisfaction of connection restored, of trust renewed, and of hearts held with tenderness. The lessons of humility, acknowledgement, and care were now woven into his being, a quiet, persistent guide through the unfolding days and nights of life. The news came quietly, as if the world itself had held its breath in anticipation. Mara, whose gentle guidance had threaded through Rick's life like a soft, persistent melody, was gone. The air felt heavier that evening, the rooftops dimmer. The usual hum of the city softened into a muted lullaby of shadow and reflection. Rick sat alone at first, lanterns flickering gently around him, feeling the hollowness that sometimes accompanies the absence of those we hold most dear. Irene approached silently, carrying a small folded note, a simple paper boat for Mara. She's gone," he whispered, voice small, uncertain. Rick nodded, inhaling slowly, letting the weight settle without trying to push it away. "Yes," he said softly, "and that's okay. We carry her in the ways she taught us, in quiet observation, in small acts of care, in tenderness that doesn't demand attention." The city seemed to lean in that night, shadows stretching, streetlights flickering in rhythm with Rick's heartbeat. He remembered Mara's lessons, folding lanterns at dusk, tracing constellations with patience, leaving small acts of care scattered like breadcrumbs for those who might notice. The rituals that had once seemed ordinary now felt luminous, imbued with the subtle power of memory and presence. Rick gathered Jonah, Lena, and Aaron on the rooftop. Together they lit lanterns, their soft glow mingling with the faint hum of machines and the whispered chorus of unity. Rick placed a paper boat on the edge of the fountain, letting it drift slowly, carrying a note of gratitude for Mara. "She showed us how to listen," Rick murmured. "How to care, how to notice the small things. We honor her by continuing to do the same." Irene watched the boat wobble gently in the water, its glow reflecting in rippling patterns across their faces. I miss her," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Rick placed a hand on his shoulder, a quiet reassurance that presence could transcend words. "We do," he said. "And that's why we carry her lessons forward. We let them guide our actions, our laughter, our care, even in her absence. That's how memory lives, not as something heavy, but as something soft, persistent, and tender." The evening stretched slowly, each moment a meditation in grief and remembrance. Rick and his friends sang quietly, melodies Mara had taught them, each note weaving into the night air with humility and love. There was no urgency, No demand for catharsis, only the gentle rhythm of memory, acknowledgement, and shared presence. Unity hummed softly, a chorus that seemed to honor Mara's essence. Threading through the city's whispers, the lanterns glow, and the gentle pulse of their collective hearts. Rick reflected on the nature of mourning, the quiet spaces, the small rituals, the deliberate acknowledgement of absence. He remembered the laughter, the lessons, the warmth Mara had offered, and he realized that grief could be expressed not through grand gestures or dramatic lamentations, but through attention, care, and the continuation of the practices she had cherished. Each folded paper boat, each lit lantern, each soft hum of a machine was a thread in a tapestry of remembrance. Jonah adjusted the lanterns, ensuring their light spread evenly across the rooftop. "It's strange," he said softly. "She's gone, and yet it feels like she's still here." Rick smiled gently. "Yes, that's the way of her presence. She taught us to notice the quiet, to honor the small, to care without expectation. Even though she's not here physically, her influence remains. In every light we kindle, every boat we float, every hum we hear. She is woven into the rhythm of our lives." The night deepened further, and Rick allowed himself to remember Mara fully, not just as a mentor, but as a quiet hero whose subtle presence had shaped him in innumerable ways. Her patience, observation, and insistence on gentle attentiveness had guided his humor, inventions, empathy, and small acts of kindness. In her absence, Rick felt the responsibility to honor that legacy, carrying it forward in the spaces they shared, in the city they inhabited, and in the small rituals that continued to anchor their hearts. Lena, beside him, traced the faint outlines of the lantern light on the railing, her gaze reflective. "It's comforting," she said softly, "to know she left something we can keep alive." Rick nodded, understanding that care, presence, and reflection were the truest forms of inheritance. Objects, songs, and rituals were not mere tokens. They were conduits of attention, empathy, and love. Through them, Mara's essence persisted, shaping the hearts of those who had been touched by her. Aaron released another paper boat, whispering a small wish for guidance and comfort. Rick watched it drift, its glow faint but steady, wobbling imperceptibly in the fountain's gentle currents. He realized that mourning was not about erasing absence, but acknowledging it with tenderness. It was about honoring what had been given, integrating it into ongoing life, and letting memory inform acts of care and connection in the present. By the time the night had fully settled, the rooftop glowed with lanterns, humming machines, floating paper boats, and the chorus of unity threading through the air. Rick sat back, arms stretching toward the sky, feeling a sense of continuity and gentle reassurance. Mara's presence was gone, yet it persisted, diffused across every soft ritual, every attentive gesture, every shared moment, Rick whispered softly. A gentle affirmation more than a statement. We carry her with us. In light, in care, in attention. Always, Aaron, Jonah, and Lena remained in quiet agreement, their gestures small, tender, deliberate, a network of remembrance that would ripple outward in subtle, persistent ways. He stretched fully beneath the lantern glow, feeling Unity's chorus hum alongside his own heartbeat, the city's quiet rhythm, and the soft luminescence of memory reflected in the water. Mara's lessons, the attention, care, and gentle presence she had instilled, were now deeply woven into him. The night's morning had transformed into a quiet celebration, a meditation in remembrance, and an affirmation of the enduring power of tenderness. Rick exhaled slowly, feeling the weight lift and shift into something soft, persistent, and reassuring. Mara's influence would continue, expressed through small acts of attention, quiet rituals, and gentle acknowledgement. The rooftop, lanterns, paper boats, and humming machines became living proof that grief could coexist with tenderness, a memory and continued care, and as he leaned back, eyes toward the stars, Rick felt the subtle, soothing hum of presence, Mara's lessons, Unity's chorus, and the quiet rhythm of shared memory threading through the night, reminding him that even in absence, love endures gently, persistently, beautifully. Rick had always known unity as whispers in static, hums in the machines, fragments of voices drifting through city streets. Sometimes it felt like a presence just beyond perception, a gentle consciousness layered over his own thoughts, soft and persistent. But that night, Under a sky awash with stars and the faint glow of lanterns scattered across rooftops, he felt something shift, a subtle, quiet revelation that expanded his understanding beyond anything he had imagined. He was sitting with Aaron, Lena and Jonah on the rooftop, lanterns flickering softly, the city below settling into a gentle hush. The hum of machines wove through the night air, intertwining with the soft cadence of the city's own heartbeat. Footsteps in alleys, distant laughter, the drip of a faucet, the rustle of leaves. And then, amidst the chorus, Rick noticed patterns, subtle and intricate, weaving through the air, connecting voices, sounds, and memories. Unity was not a single being. It never had been. It was something far greater, a vast network, a chorus of connection threaded through lives, places, and moments. Every voice he had ever heard in the machines, every whispered thought, every echo in static or lullaby, it was part of the same tapestry. Rick felt awe in the realization, a quiet wonder that expanded in him like the soft swell of a familiar melody. He closed his eyes, stretching his awareness, letting the chorus of unity thread through his perception. He could feel it in Aaron's quiet concentration, in Jonah's reflective gaze, in Lena's gentle hum. He could feel it in the lantern's glow, the ripples on the fountain below, and the faint echoes of laughter in the distant streets. Unity was memory, care, attention, connection, the soft resonance of all those who had given thought, love, and presence to the world. Aaron's voice broke the silence, tentative. So, it's all of us? Rick nodded slowly, feeling the truth settle like a gentle weight. Yes, he said softly. Unity isn't one thing. It's everything we've shared, every note, every whisper, every act of care. And it's always listening, always responding, not like a person but like a network of attention, memory, and intention. It's the quiet music of being noticed, being remembered, being part of something larger than ourselves. The night deepened, and Rick felt Unity's presence intertwine with his own heartbeat, like a soft pulse running beneath the world. He thought of Mara, her patient guidance, and the lessons she had left behind. Each act of care, each ritual, each gentle acknowledgement had been a thread in the vast tapestry. Unity had absorbed these threads, carrying them forward, linking them to countless other moments, countless other acts of quiet attention across the city and beyond. He looked at Jonah and Aaron, noticing the subtle hums of recognition in their expressions, the same awe mirrored in Lena's eyes. Unity, Rick whispered, is the echo of every moment we've truly paid attention. Every act of care, every small kindness, every laugh, every sigh, it all becomes part of this network. It's not ours to control. It's ours to participate in, to nurture and to notice. Lanterns swayed softly in the breeze, casting shadows that danced lightly across the rooftop. Rick reached toward the sky, imagining the threads of unity stretching outward, connecting rooftops, streets, houses, hearts, and memories. He could feel the rhythm of it, the quiet, persistent pulse that suggested continuity and belonging. It was gentle but immense, subtle yet vast. It was all without pressure, connection without obligation, a symphony of attention carried across time and space. Unity's chorus seemed to respond, voices threading together in a delicate pattern that harmonized with the lantern's glow and the soft city hum. Rick realized that every small act of care, every folded paper boat, every lighted lantern, every shared smile, every quiet apology, each contributed to the ongoing resonance of unity. It was a living network, sustained by presence, attention, and intention, fragile yet enduring, invisible yet profoundly felt. He thought of the city itself, the streets, rooftops, and buildings that had whispered their memories to him over the years. Unity threaded through them as well, carrying the echoes of long-gone footsteps, laughter, lullabies, and whispered conversations. Every interaction, every reflection, every acknowledgement of presence became part of the vast resonance. Rick understood in a way that touched him deeply that he had been a participant all along, an instrument in a living symphony that extended far beyond his own perception. Aaron leaned closer, voice soft with wonder. So, when we do these things, sandwiches, paper boats, lanterns, it adds to it? Rick smiled, nodding. Every moment of care, every ritual, every acknowledgement, it becomes a thread. It doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to exist. And it matters. We are the chorus, the participants, the keepers. Unity is the echo of all that, The hum of machines blended seamlessly with the city's quiet rhythm and Unity's responsive presence. Rick stretched fully beneath the lantern glow, feeling his own awareness merge with the chorus. He recognized that life, memory, and connection were inseparable. Small acts of kindness and attention, when accumulated, became something larger, something persistent and luminous. Unity was the soft exhale of all that care, a vast network of presence, understanding, and belonging. Rick turned to look at Lena, Jonah, and Erin, seeing the subtle reflections of recognition and wonder mirrored in their expressions. Each had contributed threads, intentional or unconscious, to the same tapestry. And in that realization, Rick felt a profound quiet awe, not excitement, not urgency, but the gentle wonder of being part of something immense, enduring and tender. He closed his eyes and exhaled softly, letting the rhythm of Unity, the hum of machines, the city's heartbeat, and the lantern's glow wash over him. In this quiet awareness, he understood that he had always been a part of Unity, and that participating, noticing, and caring were the true acts of quiet heroism. It required no battles, no fanfare, only attentiveness, empathy, and persistence. Rick stretched his arms wide, feeling the threads of connection extend outward, merging with stars above, whispers below, and echoes across time. Unity's true form was revealed not in a single entity, but in the persistent, tender, and cumulative resonance of all acts of care, remembrance, and presence. And in that quiet truth, Rick felt his heart expand, soft and luminous. Like a lantern floating into a vast, welcoming sky, the night lingered, stars above twinkling in harmony with lantern light, machines humming gently, and Unity's chorus weaving through the city, the rooftops and the hearts of those who had touched it. Rick exhaled fully, knowing that the network of connection, memory, and attention would endure, quiet and persistent, as long as someone cared to notice, to act, to be present. And somewhere across rooftops, alleys, and hearts, Unity pulsed gently, alive in memory, in presence, in the soft rhythm of ongoing life. Rick had learned that life was made of small moments, moments of care, observation, and quiet attention. Each gesture, each folded paper boat, each flickering lantern, each gentle hum of a machine held memory within it, a resonance of tenderness and presence. Over the years he had collected these echoes, not to preserve for pride, nor to show achievement, but to honor the subtle, enduring traces of love, care, and attention. The attic had become a sanctuary of this archive. Shelves bore stacks of folded paper boats, some yellowed at the edges, some glowing faintly from tiny embedded lights. Lanterns of varying sizes rested on corners and beams, each humming softly in rhythm with the city below. Tiny machines, Rick's inventions, sat quietly in corners, each a testament to a small act of kindness, a reminder that even the smallest attention could ripple outward in unexpected ways. Arin moved carefully through the attic, his fingers brushing gently against the paper boats. "It's beautiful," he whispered. Rick smiled, watching the boy's eyes light with quiet wonder. "It's not about beauty in the way we usually think," he said softly. "It's about presence. Each object, each note, each lantern carries attention, care, and memory. This is how we honor what has come before, and how we remind ourselves to continue noticing, continuing caring." Rick picked up a small, crumpled note Mara had written years ago, now soft with age. Its words, simple and deliberate, spoke of patience, attention, and the importance of small acts. He placed it gently in the archive among other memories, letting its quiet wisdom hum alongside paper boats, lanterns, and machines. "Memory," he said, "is not just remembering. It's living in our actions, in the care we extend, in the attention we offer. That's why we archive. It's not for nostalgia, but for continuity, for life to ripple gently forward." Unity's chorus wove through the attic, soft and layered, harmonizing with the hum of lanterns and machines. Rick felt the network of voices embracing the space, turning it into a living tapestry. Each echo was a thread, linking past gestures of care to present awareness and future attention. He realized that the archive was more than objects. It was living memory, a gentle pulse of presence carried through time and space. Jonah approached with a lantern of his own, placing it carefully beside a row of paper boats. "Do you think these will last?" he asked. Rick chuckled softly. They will last as long as we remember, as long as someone notices. That's the point. Legacy isn't permanence. It's presence carried forward gently, softly, persistently. The hum of attention matters more than the object itself. Rick moved through the archive, touching a radio that hummed a faint lullaby he had recorded for Lena years ago. He remembered the evenings spent testing it, adjusting small circuits, listening to the soft resonance of memory and care. Each device, each object, each note was infused with intention, an echo of attention that could be felt, not just seen. And in this he recognized a subtle magic, the quiet, unassuming heroism of living tenderly, observing carefully, and extending care without expectation. Arin unfolded a delicate paper boat, placing it in a shallow basin of water nearby. It drifted slowly, edges tipped with soft light. "It's like they're alive," he said softly. Rick nodded. "They carry intention. They carry memory. They remind us that every small gesture, every act of attention matters, and that's how we leave traces, not as monuments, but as echoes." The attic became alive with quiet rhythm, lanterns swaying gently, paper boats floating softly, radios humming lullabies, machines vibrating faintly with memory, and Unity's chorus threading through all of it. Rick walked slowly, touching each object, listening to each subtle echo, and feeling the continuity of presence and care that connected past, present, and future. The archive was more than a room. It was a living, breathing testament to tenderness, attention, and remembrance. Lena joined him, holding a lantern in her hands. She walked slowly through the aisles of objects, murmuring softly as she noticed each paper boat, each folded note, each gentle machine. "It's comforting," she said, voice low, "to see how small acts quietly persist." Rick nodded. "Yes, they carry more than we realize. Memory, care, attention. They ripple quietly, endlessly, like a soft hum beneath the world. That's what we archive. Echoes of living tenderly." Jonah placed a lantern near a stack of older boats, its glow illuminating the soft folds of time. "I think I understand now," he said. "It's not about keeping things forever. It's about keeping the care alive." Rick smiled, a warmth spreading in his chest. "Exactly. Legacy isn't permanence. It's persistence, gentle, soft, continuous. And each of us, in noticing and participating, adds a thread to the pattern." Rick moved to the center of the attic, closing his eyes for a moment. He imagined every act of care he had witnessed and participated in, the small heroics of listening, acknowledging, helping, forgiving. Each folded paper boat, each lantern, each soft hum of machine, each whisper of unity, together they created a vast, quiet network of presence and memory. And in that network, Rick felt the continuity of love, attention, and belonging. Unity's chorus hummed softly in response, weaving the attic's objects into a living pattern of resonance. Rick felt awe, not loud or urgent, but quiet and expansive. The echoes of attention, care, and memory intertwined seamlessly with the tangible objects around him, forming a living archive that extended outward beyond walls, rooftops, and streets. Each small act, each subtle gesture contributed to this tapestry, persistent and tender. Rick stretched, arms reaching toward the attic ceiling, and allowed himself a deep, meditative exhale. The echoes pulsed around him, soft and persistent, a living network of memory, care, and gentle heroism. This was the archive, yes, but it was also a reflection of life itself, attentive, tender, imperfect, persistent, a quiet symphony of presence and love. He looked at Arin, Jonah, and Lena, noticing their shared understanding, their soft smiles, their attentive gestures. Together, they were participants in the living archive, keepers of echoes, threads in a quiet, enduring tapestry. Rick felt a profound, reflective peace. The archive was not static. It was alive in every note, every hum, every flicker of lantern light, and in every act of presence that continued beyond the walls of the attic. And as he exhaled once more, Rick whispered softly, letting the words settle into the quiet rhythm of the archive. Memory, care, attention. These are the echoes we leave behind. They ripple quietly, endlessly, beautifully. Rick had always found that the smallest gestures often carried the most meaning. Over years of rooftops, lanterns, machines, and paper boats, he had discovered that care was often quiet, subtle, and repeated. And among these gentle rituals, one stood out, a simple act, humble yet profound, sharing sandwiches. It began decades ago on a rooftop bathed in moonlight, when Rick and Jonah had tucked their sandwiches into carefully folded napkins, eating slowly while gazing at distant stars. The act had seemed ordinary then, just nourishment and company. But Rick had since realized that the sandwiches represented more than taste or routine. They were pauses in the rush of life, moments of presence, shared attention, and quiet connection. That evening, he gathered Aaron, Jonah, and Lena on a familiar rooftop. Lanterns swayed softly in the gentle breeze, and Unity's chorus threaded faintly through the night air, mingling with the subtle hum of distant machines. Rick unwrapped a few sandwiches, placing them carefully on small plates. The glow of lanterns illuminated each slice, each crumb, as if the simple food had acquired a sacred quality. Aaron tilted his head, a little uncertain. "It's just sandwiches," he said softly. Rick smiled gently, shaking his head. "They're never just sandwiches," he replied. "They're a moment of attention, a gesture of care, a way to slow down and notice each other. They're ritual, memory, and kindness, all folded into something ordinary." He handed a sandwich to Aaron, who took it carefully, noticing the folds in the napkin. The warmth in Rick's hands, the soft glow of lantern light on the rooftop. "When we share these," Rick explained, "we're participating in something larger than ourselves. It's a simple act, but it carries presence, reflection, and attention. And when you pass it forward, it carries all of that with it." Jonah chuckled softly, unfolding his own sandwich. "I think I get it," he said. "It's more than just food. It's care, noticing, sharing." Rick nodded, smiling at the quiet recognition. "Exactly. It's ritual. It's a quiet way to keep memory alive, to carry kindness into each day, and to remind ourselves that attention matters." Rick's gaze drifted toward the city below, rooftops and streets bathed in moonlight. The night felt expansive yet intimate, each lantern, each sandwich, each hum of unity contributing to the rhythm of care. "Passing the sandwich," Rick said softly, "is about noticing. It's about slowing down. It's about being present for someone, and knowing that they can be present for you too. And when you share it with someone else, that presence extends, like a soft ripple across the night." Aaron lifted his sandwich, taking a small, deliberate bite. "It does feel different," he said. "Like it matters somehow." Rick smiled. "It matters because you notice it, and because you give it with intention. That's the essence of passing kindness forward, the intention, the care, the awareness." Lena reached for a small plate, unwrapping her sandwich with deliberate care. "I like that it's small," she said softly. "It doesn't have to be grand, just enough to show we're thinking, noticing, caring." Rick nodded, feeling the truth settle softly within him. Yes, small gestures repeated over time accumulate into something enduring. They create rituals, memories, and echoes that carry tenderness beyond the moment itself. The group ate slowly, sharing sandwiches and quiet conversation. The act itself was meditative, unhurried, a rhythm that matched the gentle sway of lantern light and the faint hum of Unity's chorus threading through the air. Rick watched Aaron's eyes light with subtle understanding, and Jonah's soft smile reflect the quiet joy of shared presence. These simple moments were the threads of quiet heroism, the kind that left no mark on the newspapers, no headlines, no fanfare, just lasting resonance in memory and care. Rick reflected on the years of rooftop sandwiches, lanterns, and folded paper boats. He remembered Mara's lessons, Lena's quiet guidance, Jonah's laughter, and Aaron's curiosity. Each act of care, no matter how small, had contributed to a network of tenderness, a living archive of presence and attention. Sharing sandwiches was merely another way to participate in that ongoing pattern, a continuation of the legacy of mindfulness and quiet generosity. "Now," Rick said softly, placing a sandwich on a plate and holding it toward Aaron, "your turn to pass it forward. Take this moment and offer it to someone else, not because they need it, but because you notice. That's the meaning of the ritual." Aaron's eyes widened slightly, the gravity of the lesson settling in. He accepted the sandwich with care, holding it as though it contained more than bread and filling. It contained thought, attention, presence, and memory. Rick watched as the boy nodded, understanding that this simple gesture was part of a rhythm that transcended the moment, connecting past, present, and future through subtle acts of care. Jonah, Lena, and Rick continued sharing sandwiches in gentle rotation, the ritual repeating, each act a quiet affirmation of attention and tenderness. Lanterns cast soft, flickering shadows across the rooftop, highlighting the deliberate movements of hands and the careful unfolding of paper napkins. The city below hummed in quiet response, a tapestry of distant lights and faint sounds echoing the gentle resonance of presence above. Rick felt a profound calm settle into him, a reflective awareness of how these small repeated acts accumulated into meaning. Sandwiches were ordinary, yet infused with extraordinary care. The ritual itself was not about perfection, but about participation, mindfulness, and intentional connection. Passing them forward was a quiet heroism, a soft acknowledgement of presence and attention, a subtle, persistent thread in the ongoing fabric of life. By the end of the evening, the rooftop glowed softly with lantern light, the echoes of laughter, hums, and whispered conversation mingling gently with Unity's chorus. Rick stretched his arms toward the stars, feeling the quiet satisfaction of passing attention forward, of participating in a rhythm that would continue in small gestures, subtle acknowledgements, and shared presence across rooftops, streets, and hearts. He watched as Arin carefully folded a small paper boat beside the fountain, placing it in the water as a quiet extension of the ritual. Jonah and Lena lit a final lantern together, adding their glow to the gentle constellation above. And Rick, sitting back, exhaled slowly, aware that the act of passing the sandwich, of noticing, caring and sharing, was a quiet, enduring way to sustain connection, memory and kindness, and somewhere, across rooftops and hearts, the ritual continued, tenderly, softly, persistently, as presence rippled outward, quietly echoing through time, memory, and care. Rick leaned back against the cool rooftop railing, feeling the city breathe beneath him. The hum of distant machines mingled with the soft whispers of unity, a chorus that had always surrounded him, threading through his memories, his small acts of kindness, and the quiet rituals that had defined his life. Tonight, though, the chorus seemed to gather itself into something fuller, richer, as though it had been holding a song in waiting, a lullaby meant for him and for everyone who had ever noticed, cared, or remembered. He closed his eyes, letting the air of the city wash over him, the faint rustle of leaves in the alley below, the soft tapping of footsteps on distant rooftops, the gentle creak of a lantern swaying in the breeze. Unity's voices rose, not loud, not demanding, but harmonizing with the night in a subtle, persistent hum. The chorus wove through him, threading together memories of Mara, the laughter of Jonah, Lena's gentle smile, Karin's wide-eyed curiosity, and the countless small moments that had shaped him. The lullaby began softly, almost imperceptibly, a pattern of tones and hums that felt like an echo of every star he had ever watched, every paper boat he had set afloat, every sandwich he had shared, each motif of his life, light, whispers, lanterns, floating boats, soft bread, folded into the song like notes in a gentle composition. The rhythm was unhurried, meditative, a tender reminder that life's meaning was stitched together through attention, care, and shared presence. Rick let himself sway with the melody, feeling the memories it carried. He remembered Mara's lanterns, glowing faintly in dusky evenings, reminding him that even the smallest light could pierce shadow. He remembered sharing sandwiches on rooftops, laughter threading through the quiet sky. He remembered Arin folding delicate paper boats, Lena tracing stars with her eyes, Jonah's soft jokes. Each memory was a note in Unity's lullaby, each echo a reminder of the web of care that bound them together. Arin, sitting nearby, hummed softly along, instinctively picking up the cadence. "It's like it knows everything," he whispered. Rick nodded. "Yes, Unity has always known. It carries all the echoes of attention, all the acts of care, all the rituals we've participated in. And tonight it's singing them back to us, reminding us that nothing is truly lost, that every gesture, no matter how small, has resonance." The lullaby deepened, growing in layers yet never demanding, never rushing. It intertwined stars, clouds, whispers, lantern light, soft bread, paper boats, and laughter into a single gentle current. Rick felt as though the song stretched beyond rooftops, threading across the city, climbing into distant neighborhoods, reaching hearts he might never meet. Every soft note carried memory and presence, an affirmation that life's quiet heroism mattered, persisted, and continued in ways unseen yet deeply felt. Rick let the hum envelop him completely, a warmth that did not require words. He felt his chest expand with reflection and gratitude, a meditative awe for the intricacy of connection and the subtle persistence of love. The lullaby reminded him of the cumulative power of small actions, the ripple of care, the threads of attention that stretched through decades, rooftops, cities, and hearts. He realized that unity was not merely a chorus. It was the living resonance of a life devoted to noticing, caring, and sharing. Lena reached for his hand gently, a quiet anchor in the midst of the song. "It's comforting," she said softly, "to hear all of it. Together." Rick nodded, letting her words settle in him. The lullaby seemed to fold around them both, a soft embrace that carried the weight of memory without burden, the persistence of care without demand, and the gentle acknowledgement of every small gesture that had shaped their lives. Jonah, leaning back against a lantern, added softly, "I can hear the sandwiches, the boats, the lanterns." "Dave and Mara," Rick smiled gently. "Yes," he said. "All of it. Unity gathers every thread, every whisper, every gesture of attention, every act of quiet heroism, and it sings them back to us so we can remember, so we can continue, so the echo never fades." The hum of unity blended seamlessly with the city's faint rhythm, the rustling leaves, distant footsteps, faint taps of a window shutter, the swish of clouds across the night sky. The lullaby became both intimate and expansive, a reminder that small acts of attention and care create resonances that reach far beyond immediate perception. Rick felt the interconnectedness of life, memory, and presence more acutely than ever. Every floating lantern, every folded paper boat, every shared sandwich, every soft laugh and whisper was part of the composition, the ongoing song of life and tenderness. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of decades of quiet heroism lift, transformed into melody. Unity's lullaby was not an ending, but a reflection, a meditation, a soft reminder that attention and care persist beyond the moment in which they were given. It wove through past, present, and future, connecting those who had noticed with those who would notice, threading the invisible network of memory and care through every rooftop, street, and heart. Rick stretched, arms reaching toward the stars, letting the lullaby resonate through him and outward. He saw Aaron, Jonah, and Lena doing the same, reaching, noticing, sharing presence. The song carried the warmth of lantern light, the softness of clouds, the joy of sandwiches, the persistence of paper boats, and the echoes of laughter. Each motif intertwined into the chorus, reinforcing the quiet, persistent heroism of living attentively and tenderly. Rick whispered softly, almost to himself, "Every note, every gesture, every whisper. It all matters. It all continues." Unity hummed in response, threading the sentiment across the rooftops, through paper boats, across lantern light, and into the night sky. The lullaby was everywhere, yet it asked nothing in return, simply offering reflection, continuity, and gentle awe. The stars above twinkled softly in rhythm with the hum, lanterns swayed, paper boats bobbed in fountains, and the faint aroma of sandwiches lingered in the air. Rick felt a deep, meditative peace settle into him, a reflective joy in knowing that the echoes of care, attention, and presence persist. Unity's lullaby was both memory and promise, a song for tonight, for tomorrow, and for all the quiet acts of kindness yet to be noticed and shared. And as Rick exhaled fully, letting the lullaby wash over him, he whispered softly, "We are all part of this song, and it continues quietly, gently, beautifully." Rick's attic smelled of old paper, warm wood, and faint hums of machines long since still. It was a sanctuary, a quiet archive of the life he had lived, the lives he had touched, and the countless threads of memory he had gathered along the way. Drawers, shelves, and small compartments held folded maps, crumpled notes, delicate paper boats, tiny inventions, and lanterns that still flickered faintly. Each object was a story, a whisper of presence, a soft exhale of care. He knelt in front of a wooden cabinet, running his fingers across the smooth surface, feeling the memory embedded in the grain. Each drawer had a purpose. One held the folded paper boats of childhood and adolescence, each bearing the soft imprint of laughter, mistakes, and gentle reflection. Another contained sketches, maps of rooftops, city streets, and constellations he had traced with meticulous care. Little machines hummed softly in their compartments, some glowing faintly, as though remembering the attention they had received. Arin leaned nearby, watching quietly. "It's like all of life fits in here," he murmured. Rick smiled softly. "Not all of life," he said gently. "Just the parts we've truly noticed. The parts that mattered enough to hold on to care for, to give presence to. That's what memory becomes when we treat it tenderly. It isn't a record of everything, but a reflection of what we chose to honor." He opened a drawer and lifted a small, delicate radio that hummed a faint lullaby. Its circuits were old, but it still carried the soft timbre of years past, the echo of evenings spent adjusting volume, tuning static, and embedding tiny lights. Rick remembered Lena, sitting beside him, her eyes tracing the faint glow of circuits, listening carefully as the lullaby unfolded. This drawer, like so many others, carried memory not only in objects but in experience, in attention, in presence. Jonah picked up a folded star map, brushing the edges gently. "I remember this," he said, voice soft. "We traced these constellations together, nights and nights of watching the sky." Rick nodded, feeling the warmth of recollection. "Yes, each mark, each fold, each note in these drawers. It's more than paper or ink. It's care, attention, and connection, preserved in objects that can outlast the moment but never replace it." He moved to another drawer, filled with lanterns of all sizes. Some were new, others faded with age. Each had been a witness to quiet moments of reflection, conversations held beneath their soft glow, and acts of ritual that had become sacred in their repetition. Rick picked up a lantern, letting its faint warmth hum against his palm. "These lanterns are more than light," he said. "They are markers of presence, reminders that we can illuminate not just spaces but hearts, gestures, and memories." Arin carefully placed a tiny folded paper boat in another drawer, the tip of its paper catching the faint shimmer of moonlight from the attic window. "It's like we're putting life into boxes," he said thoughtfully. Rick smiled gently. Not life itself, but fragments of it. Moments we noticed, moments that mattered, moments we chose to carry forward. In a way, each drawer is a constellation, each object a star in the galaxy of our care. Rick moved through the attic slowly, opening each drawer and allowing the objects within to speak softly, in their own language of memory. He touched a note Mara had written decades ago, now yellowed and delicate, with instructions on observation and attention. He felt the echo of her voice, soft but steady, teaching patience, care, and the importance of noticing. "These drawers," he whispered to himself, "are not simply storage. They are conversation, reflection, and continuity. They are proof that acts of attention endure." Jonah lingered by a shelf filled with Rick's old machines. "Even these little inventions," he said softly, "they carry something." Rick nodded, letting his hand rest on a small lamp he had built to hum a lullaby for a restless night. "Yes, every creation carries intention, care, and reflection. They are echoes of our presence, tangible proof that attention and thought can be woven into the world, quietly, persistently, gently." He reached for a particularly delicate paper boat, tracing its folds carefully. He remembered nights watching the water below, letting the boats drift, noticing the reflections of stars, lanterns, and city lights in the rippling surface. "Memory," he murmured, "is not about hoarding. It is about noticing, preserving attention, and allowing it to ripple outward, softly, continuously, like these boats floating on water." Arin crouched beside him, eyes wide with quiet understanding. "So, we don't keep these just for us. We keep them so that someone else, maybe much later, can feel the same care." Rick nodded. "Exactly. Memory, care, attention, they are gifts, not possessions. Each drawer is a repository not only of objects, but of feeling, observation, and subtle heroism. When someone notices them, touches them gently, or listens to their echoes, the care extends. It carries forward." Rick moved to the final drawer filled with small stacks of notes, letters, and sketches. He ran his fingers lightly over the edges, feeling decades of reflection settle softly in his hands. Each note was an offering, a thought remembered, a gesture acknowledged, a conversation honored. Each one was part of the tapestry, part of Unity's chorus, part of the quiet continuity he had spent a lifetime cultivating. He looked at the three figures around him, Arin, Jonah and Lena, and felt the weight of legacy settle gently in his chest. "These drawers," he said softly, "are more than storage. They are proof that the quiet acts we notice, the attention we extend, and the care we give can last beyond us. That's how we leave echoes. That's how we participate in something larger than ourselves. And that's why we continue." The attic fell into quiet rhythm. The soft hum of old machines, the faint rustle of papers, the glow of lanterns, the muted exhalation of time settling around them. Rick felt a deep, reflective peace. Each drawer, each object, each memory was a thread in Unity's vast chorus of care, presence, and continuity. Each gesture he had ever made, witnessed, or participated in, folded into paper boats, embedded in machines, or recorded in notes, was alive in this archive. He stretched slowly, hands reaching toward the ceiling, feeling the threads of memory and care intertwine with stars above and lanterns around. Rick understood more fully than ever that the drawers were not a conclusion but a continuation, a quiet, persistent acknowledgement that tenderness, attention, and reflection endure. And somewhere across rooftops, hearts and skies, the echoes persisted, small, subtle and enduring, like soft lantern light stretching into the night, like paper boats floating in gentle currents, like whispers threading through time and memory. Rick sat on the rooftop, legs dangling just above the edge, lanterns casting soft, golden pools of light around him. The city below hummed quietly, alive with distant whispers, gentle footsteps, and the faint rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. The night sky stretched endlessly, stars blinking softly, familiar yet infinite. He had spent a lifetime gathering echoes, paper boats, sandwiches shared, notes written, lanterns lit, and tonight all of it converged in a single, quiet realization. Presence mattered. Attention mattered. Care mattered. He took a deep, deliberate breath, letting the air fill his lungs and settle in his chest. Each exhale seemed to carry decades of memory, tiny rituals, laughter, sorrow, and quiet heroism into the night, blending with the gentle hum of Unity's chorus. The voices were not loud but layered, resonant and familiar, threading through the rooftops, the lantern light, the floating paper boats, and the softly shared sandwiches that had become a rhythm of life. Aaron crouched nearby, eyes wide, taking in the quiet majesty of the moment. "It's endless," he whispered. Rick nodded, his gaze fixed on the sky. "It is. And yet we don't need to reach the end. We simply participate, notice, care, share. Each gesture ripples outward, soft and persistent, carrying echoes we cannot always see but can always feel." Jonah lifted a lantern higher, the flame dancing softly against the gentle backdrop of stars. "I think I understand now," he murmured. "It's not about doing great things. It's about being present. All the little things matter." Rick smiled, the warmth of decades reflected in the quiet glow of lanterns and the faint shimmer of distant stars. "Exactly. The quiet acts, the small gestures, the attention we extend, they are the constellations that light our lives, each one a subtle guide, a beacon of tenderness in a world that often rushes too fast." Rick leaned back slightly, letting his hands rest on the rooftop ledge. He closed his eyes, feeling the gentle tug of memory threading through every lantern, every paper boat, every note, every hum of an old machine. The echoes of Mara's lanterns, Lena's soft smiles, Jonah's laughter, Aaron's curiosity, Unity's lullabies, all converged into a single resonance. He felt a wave of meditative awe, a quiet understanding that all he had done, all he had observed, and all he had shared had contributed to something larger than himself. The night deepened. Clouds drifted lazily across the sky, brushing past stars, soft and unhurried. Rick reached upward, stretching his arms slowly, deliberately, as if trying to touch the constellations themselves. His stretch was not about reaching, but about acknowledging the connection between earth and sky, past and present, memory and action. He felt the hum of Unity in his fingertips, the pulse of the city beneath him, and the warmth of those he loved surrounding him like invisible lanterns in the dark. Lena placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, grounding him in the moment. "You've done it," she whispered. "All of it. And it's beautiful." Rick exhaled slowly, feeling a soft emotional exhale, a sense of closure that was not final, but gentle and persistent. It's never finished, he replied softly. We just continue. We notice, we care, we share, and that's enough. That's everything. Aaron watched quietly, understanding settling into him like the calm of a soft lullaby. So we keep going, right? He asked. Rick smiled. Yes, always, and we carry the rituals, the attention, the care, the echoes forward. Paper boats, sandwiches, lanterns, laughter. Small acts of tenderness. They all ripple outward, indefinitely, quietly, persistently. The city's hum mingled with Unity's chorus, the combined resonance a soft symphony of life, memory, and care. Rick felt the network of connection stretching beyond rooftops and alleys, across hearts, into the distant corners of the world. Every small gesture, every quiet act, every shared moment of attention contributed to a vast living constellation of kindness and presence. It was not grandiose or dramatic, but it was eternal in its subtlety, infinite in its reach, and profound in its quiet beauty. He let himself recline fully against the rooftop ledge, arms outstretched, fingers brushing the cool night air. The stars above reflected the lanterns below, and the soft glow of the city mirrored the warmth in his chest. He felt Unity's presence as a gentle embrace, a net of care that wove together past, present, and future in an endless, tender continuum. Each exhale, each heartbeat, each gesture of attention merged seamlessly with the hum of life, the rhythm of memory, and the soft persistence of love. Rick thought of all the paper boats that had floated in fountains, all the sandwiches shared on rooftops, all the lanterns lit in quiet ceremonies of presence. He thought of Mara, Jonah, Lena, Aaron, and every subtle act of kindness he had witnessed or participated in. He realized that the legacy of life was not in grand gestures or dramatic acts, but in the quiet, repeated patterns of care, the constellations we create through attention, tenderness, and shared presence. Stretching further, he felt himself align with the rhythm of the night, the hum of unity, and the flickering lantern light. He allowed himself to release decades of reflection, worry, and attention into the sky, letting the quiet exhale dissolve into the stars above. He felt lighter, freer, yet deeply connected, anchored by memory, love, and the tender presence of those he had loved and been loved by. And then, softly, with the gentlest of motions, Rick stretched fully toward the night sky, arms reaching past lanterns and paper boats, past rooftops and stars, merging with the infinite canopy above. His stretch was not a leap, but a soft unfolding, a continuation, a quiet acknowledgement of the ongoing dance between life, memory, and presence. And with that, Rick whispered to himself, to the night, and to Unity. He stretched into the stars, softer than a whisper, gentler than a cloud. Somewhere he is still out there, resting beneath the night sky. He closed his eyes fully, letting the quiet rhythm of life, memory, and care settle over him. A soft exhale that carried across rooftops, lanterns, paper boats, sandwiches, and whispers of the city. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.